On October 28, 2022.
I now invite the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to make a statement. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32-2, I have the honour to table, in both official languages, the Fall Economic Statement 2022. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, I would also like to table, in both official languages, a notice of a Ways and Means motion to implement certain provisions of the Fall Economic Statement tabled in Parliament on November 3rd, 2022, and certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on April 7th, 2022. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-2, I would ask that an order of the day be designated for the consideration of this motion. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Au cours des derniers mois, j'ai voyagé d'un bout à l'autre de notre pays. J'ai visité une vingtaine de villes pour rencontrer des travailleurs canadiens et des entreprises canadiennes. J'ai visité une fabricante de pièces d'automobile à Etobicoke et une mine de potasse, tout juste en dehors de Saskatoon. J'ai rencontré les femmes et les hommes de Sherbrooke qui fabriquent les bottes que portent nos forces armées partout dans le world. I visited the port of St. John in New Brunswick and a family farm in Olds, Alberta, and in Dartmouth and in Brampton and in Calgary. I spent time with some of the truckers who keep our economy humming. The Canadians I spoke to were all so proud of our country. They were proud of the hard work they do every day to feed Canada and the world, to build our cars, to send our goods to global markets, to raise their children. But they were also anxious about whether our future will be as prosperous as our past, and anxious about paying the bills today. And that's where I want to start, with the high cost of living so many of us, so many Canadians are concerned about. I know that it has felt like just one thing after another since COVID first reached our shores. We turned the economy off, and then we turned it back on again. Vladimir Putin illegally invaded Ukraine, and now we're dealing with inflation. These are related, of course. Global inflation isn't created by the decisions of any one government alone, but by the combined aftershocks of 2.5 years of historic turmoil. L'inflation était de 6,9% en septembre, après avoir diminué pour le troisième mois consécutif. Ce taux est plus bas qu'aux États-Unis, au Royaume-Uni et dans la zone euro. Mais pour les Canadiens, pour qui c'est difficile à la caisse ou lorsqu'ils font le plein, l'inflation est encore trop élevée. C'est une période difficile pour beaucoup d'entre nous, pour nos amis, pour nos familles, pour nos voisins. And it's important, as both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, that I'm honest with Canadians about the challenges that still lie ahead. Interest rates are rising as the Bank of Canada steps in to tackle inflation. And that means our economy is slowing down. It means there are people whose mortgage payments are rising. It means business is no longer booming in the same way it has been since we left our homes after the COVID lockdowns and went back out into the world. That's the case in Canada, that's the case in the United States, and that is the case in economies big and small around the world. Canada cannot avoid the global slowdown any more than we could have avoided COVID once it had begun infecting the world. But we will be ready. Indeed, we are ready. That's because for the past 7 years, our government has been reinforcing Canada's social safety net. We have improved many important programs and added some new ones too. Ces investissements faits dans les Canadiens sont comme une maison bien construite, avec un toit solide, nécessaire en toute saison, mais surtout essentiel quand la température diminue. Et c'est pourquoi, alors que l'automne cède la place à l'hiver, nous allons continuer de tenir tête à ceux qui veulent réduire l'assurance d'emploi et les pensions. Les Canadiens ont contribué pendant toute leur vie active à ces programmes et dont ils ont besoin plus que jamais. C'est pourquoi nous avons créé l'allocation canadienne pour enfants et c'est pourquoi nous rendons les garderies plus abordables. C'est pourquoi nous avons bonifié les prestations sur lesquelles comptent ceux qui ont servi avec le drapeau canadien sur leur uniforme. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons doublé les bourses canadiennes aux étudiants. Pour qu'il soit un peu plus facile pour tous les jeunes d'aller au collège ou à l'université ou de faire une formation professionnelle. C'est pourquoi nous avons amélioré l'allocation canadienne pour les travailleurs. Et pour les aînés, nous avons augmenté la sécurité de l'AVS et le supplément de revenus garanti. That is why it is so important that the Canada Pension Plan and our most important benefits are all indexed to inflation. And in today's fall economic statement, that is why we're delivering on a plan that millions of Canadians voted for just over a year ago, and why we're delivering new measures to enhance the social safety net that is there to support all Canadians. We're working to deliver lower credit card fees so that small businesses don't need to choose. So that small businesses don't need to choose between cutting into their already narrow margins and passing fees on to their customers. We're taxing share buybacks to make sure that large corporations pay their fair share and to encourage them to reinvest their profits in Canadian workers and in Canada. We're delivering a multi-generational home renovation tax credit, which will help families across Canada afford to have a grandparent or a family member with a disability move back in if they want to. We're tackling housing speculation and making sure that homes are for Canadians to live in, not a frequently flipped investment asset. We're delivering on our commitment to make home ownership more affordable for young people and new Canadians with a new tax-free first home savings account that will make it so much easier to save for a down payment. And we're delivering with a doubling of the first-time home buyer's tax credit to help cover the closing costs that come with buying that first home of your own. We are permanently eliminating interest on the federal portion of Canada student loans and Canada apprentice we're working to make sure that families don't need to choose between taking their child to the dentist and putting food on the table. We're creating a new quarterly Canada Workers Benefit to deliver advance payments and put more money sooner into the pockets of our lowest paid and often most essential workers. This means the Canada Workers Benefit will now support 4.2 million Canadians. We're providing hundreds of dollars in new targeted support to low-income renters. For the Canadians who need it the most, we are doubling the GST credit for the next 6 months. And I have some very good news about that. For the 11 million Canadian households who need help the most, those GST checks will start arriving in your bank account or in your mailbox tomorrow. Nous doublons le crédit pour la TPS pendant les 6 prochains mois. Et j'ai une bonne nouvelle pour les 11 millions de ménages qui en ont le plus besoin. Ces paiements vont commencer à arriver dans leur compte de banque et dans leur boîte aux lettres dès demain. Nous offrons des mesures ciblées pour alléger l'inflation parce que c'est la bonne chose à faire. Mais pendant que la Banque du Canada lutte contre l'inflation, nous ne compliquerons pas son travail. Nous sommes compétissants et nous sommes aussi responsables. Canada has the lowest deficit and Canada has the lowest deficit and the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. In our April budget, with inflation in Canada and around the world elevated and still rising, we knew we had to chart a fiscally responsible course, and we did. In April, we committed to bringing the deficit down to just 2% of GDP this year. Today, we forecast it will be just 1.3% of our $2.8 trillion economy. We can bring the deficit down today because our pandemic spending worked. Thanks to the historic support we provided, and thanks to the incredible resilience of Canadians, Canada is entering this time of a slowing global economy from a position of fundamental economic strength. There are 400,000 more Canadians working today than before the pandemic. Our economy is now 103% the size it was before COVID hit. So far this year, Canada's economic growth has been the strongest in the G7, stronger than the United States, stronger than the United Kingdom, stronger than Germany, stronger than France, stronger than Italy or Japan. Thanks to that enviable economic performance, we're able to provide targeted support to the most vulnerable while still shrinking our deficit. In the months to come, we will be able to invest in the Canadian economy and to be there for the Canadians who need it the most, because we were responsible in April and because we are keeping our powder dry today. Canadians are tough, and the Canadian economy is resilient. And that's why we can all be confident we will get through this just as we have gotten through so much over the past 2.5 years. In fact, there is no country in the world better placed than Canada to get through There is no country better placed than Canada to get through the coming global slowdown. Et lorsque nous aurons surmonté cette épreuve, que la récession causée par la pandémie sera derrière nous, avec nos forces économiques fondamentales préservées, aucun pays au monde ne sera mieux placé que le Canada pour prospérer dans une économie mondiale post-pandémie. Nous cultivons des aliments pour nourrir la planète. Nous extrayons la potasse dont les agriculteurs d'ici et d'ailleurs ont besoin pour cultiver les légumes. Nous avons les minéraux et les métaux critiques qui sont essentiels pour tout, des téléphones cellulaires aux batteries, aux appareils électroménagers et aux voitures électriques. Nous avons les ressources naturelles pour alimenter la transition mondiale vers la carboneutralité et pour contribuer à la sécurité énergétique de nos alliés au four et à mesure que la transition s'accélère. Et ce qui est essentiel, c'est le Canada qui est la démocratie qui possède toutes ces ressources en abondance. The global economy is at a turning point. We're entering an era of friendshoring, a time when our democratic partners and their most important companies are seeking to shift their dependence from dictatorships to democracies. That's why the Prime Minister and Chancellor Scholz signed an agreement in Newfoundland for Germany to buy Canadian hydrogen. That's why the United States has moved from a Buy America to a Buy North America policy on critical minerals and electric vehicles. C'est pourquoi notre ministre de l'Industrie a signé des accords avec des constructeurs d'automobiles et des fabricants de batteries mondiaux, presque un nouvel accord par jour. That is why our Minister of Natural Resources is pitching Canada's critical minerals to the world and working hard with provinces and territories to get them out of the ground and to global markets. Because the world knows Canada can build the electric vehicles of today and tomorrow. Canadians can mine and process the critical minerals that those vehicles, our phones, and our computers are all made of. And Canadian energy workers, the very best in the world, can make Canada the leading provider of energy as the global economy moves to net zero. Our allies are counting on us. And our government believes that this ongoing shift is the most significant opportunity for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses in a generation. Les investissements annoncés dans le budget d'avril visaient à saisir cette opportunité. Et c'est également ce qui vise les investissements dans cette énoncé économique de l'OTAN, avec des crédits d'impôt à investissement importants dans les technologies propres et l'hydrogène propre, il sera plus attrayant pour les entreprises d'investir au Canada pour produire l'énergie. Cette énergie contribuera à alimenter une économie mondiale carboneutre. We are launching a new Canada Growth Fund that will help attract the billions of dollars in new private capital required to fight climate change and to create good jobs in Canada at the same time. From critical minerals to ports to energy, we will continue to make it easier for businesses to invest in major projects in Canada. Projects with meaningful Indigenous participation, projects that meet the highest environmental standards, projects that will create good jobs, and projects that will allow Canadian workers to drive our economy forward. We will continue to invest in tackling the productivity challenge that is Canada's economic Achilles heel. We will continue to invest in making sure that Canadians have the skills they need to get good-paying jobs, and we will continue to bring to Canada more of the skilled workers that our growing economy requires. But we know that these investments represent only a down payment on the work that lies ahead. And so, in the months to come, we will continue to work hard to ensure that Canada is the best place in the world for businesses to invest and create good-paying jobs from coast to coast to coast. Now, these investments, the ones we're making today and the ones we will continue to make, will be crucial to the future of the Canadian economy. They will help make Canada a leader in the industries of tomorrow. They will help to build an economy that is more sustainable and more prosperous for generations to come. But what matters most is what these investments mean for Canadians. If you're an energy worker in Alberta, investments in clean energy mean there will continue to be good-paying jobs for you and your children. If you're a young couple in Vancouver, more workers in the building trades means more affordable homes for your new family. And if you're an auto worker in Windsor, Canadian leadership on electric vehicles means you will build the next generation of the cars that have powered our economy for more than a century.
Bravo.
Canadian workers know how important our social safety net is, and that is why our government will never deplete the contributions that keep Canada's employment insurance and pensions strong. Et les Canadiens savent à quel point la formation
And
est
Canadian
importante
workers know
pour les
how
préparer
important
à
training
occuper
is
les
to
emplois
equip them
précieux
for
et
valuable,
bien
good-paying
rémunérés.
jobs.
Alors, nous
So
investissons
we are
aussi
investing
dans
in
la
that
formation.
as well.
Mais les travailleurs
But
canadiens savent
Canadian
que la
workers
chose la
also
plus
know
importante,
that the
ce
single
qui fait la
most
différence
important thing,
entre
the
réussir à
difference
payer ses
between
paiements
managing to pay your
hypothécaires
mortgage
et craindre
and
de perdre
fearing
sa
you
maison,
could lose your
ou
home,
la différence
the
entre
difference
payer ses
between
factures
paying the
et
bills
être en
at the
retard
end of the
dans
month
ses paiements.
and falling
C'est un
behind
emploi stable
is a
et
well-paid,
bien payé.
stable job,
Un travail dont
doing
vous
work
êtes
that
fiers
you are proud of
avec des gens
with
qui vous
people
respectent,
who respect
vous
you
et vos
and
compétences.
your skills.
C'est pourquoi notre
That's why
principal
our
objectif
overriding
économique pendant la
economic
pandémie
objective
était de
during
préserver
COVID
les
was to
emplois des
preserve
Canadiens.
Canadians'
Et c'est
jobs.
pourquoi aujourd'hui,
And that's
les
why
travailleurs
today,
canadiens ont
what
besoin
Canadian
d'un
workers
gouvernement
need
doté
is a
d'une
government with
véritable
a real,
politique industrielle
robust
robuste.
industrial
Un
policy,
gouvernement
a
qui
government
s'engage à
committed to
investir
investing
dans
in
la
the net
transition
zero
vers la
transition,
carboneutralité, qui
to
attire
bringing
de nouveaux
in
capitaux
new
privés,
private
qui
investment,
favorise la création
and
d'emplois
to help
bien payés
create good-paying
d'une nation
jobs
à
from
l'autre.
coast to
Et
coast
c'est
to coast.
exactement ce que
And
nous
that
avons fait.
is exactly
Et
what we've
c'est
been doing.
exactement ce
And
que nous
that
continuerons
is what
de
we
faire
are continuing
aujourd'hui.
to do today.
Now, Mr. Speaker, in 1903, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier stood in this House, and he said, "This is not a time for deliberation. This is a time for action. We cannot wait because time does not wait. We cannot wait because in these days of wonderful development, time lost is doubly lost. We cannot wait because at this moment there is a transformation going on in the conditions of our national life, which it would be folly to ignore and a crime to overlook. He was speaking then about the Transcontinental Railway, one that connected Canada and the Canadian economy from east to west, and which helped usher in a new era of prosperity for the people of our growing country. That project, like Laurier himself, was imperfect. The prosperity and opportunity it brought were not shared equally with Indigenous peoples, with women, with new Canadians. But his message then is one that we should heed today, that we must heed today. At the turn of the last century, Laurier and a generation of Canadian statesmen understood that Canada was at a turning point and that we could seize it or risk being swept aside by the manifest destiny of more ambitious leaders. Today, we are likewise at a pivotal moment. The global green transition calls for an industrial transformation comparable in scale only to the Industrial Revolution itself. And Canada is blessed with the talented people, the natural resources, and the manufacturing base needed to drive that transformation. At the same time, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine has upended geopolitics, reinforcing for our allies the value of turning to each other, to us, for the critical elements of their supply chains and for their energy security. Together, these two great shifts represent a generational opportunity to build a thriving and sustainable Canadian economy. We can lead the world in a way that far exceeds our footprint as a country of just 39 million people. Nous pouvons mener la lutte contre les changements climatiques.
We can lead the fight against climate change, and we can do it in a way that creates good jobs and new businesses for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. We can build affordable homes and deliver affordable childcare, helping our economy grow and making life more affordable for middle-class families. And we can ensure that everyone in this country can enjoy the prosperity we are investing in together. That is the future that we can create for ourselves and for our children. But we cannot wait because time truly does not wait. We cannot wait because in these days of wonderful development, time lost is doubly lost. I know that times feel tough right now, and they are. But we have a well-built house with a solid roof, and we have survived far colder winters before. And just as fall turns to winter, so too does winter turn to spring.
There are warmer days ahead, and we will reach them together by building a country where everyone can earn a good living for a hard day's work, by building an economy that works for everyone, by investing in the Canada we are all so proud of today, so that we can be even prouder of our amazing country tomorrow. Because of all the countries in the world, the 21st century will surely belong to Canada.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Prime Minister's policies have caused 4-year highs in inflation, leading to massive interest rate hikes on Canadians, which will cost Canadian families $3,000 a year. Today, the Prime Minister had a chance to give Canadians some relief by cancelling the carbon tax on home heating, but they refused. They refused, despite the fact home heating bills will increase by 50 to 100% this winter. They refused, despite billions in new tax revenue on the growling stomachs of Canadians. Will the Prime Minister stop punishing Canadians and cancel their plans to triple the carbon tax on home heating?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we absolutely understand that times are tough for so many Canadians today. And that's why I was so glad to share some great news. And that is that the GST credit will start arriving in the bank accounts and in the mailboxes of 11 million Canadian households tomorrow.
Wow.
That is much needed support. It is going to provide such valuable inflation relief to the Canadians who need it the most. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. We are moving forward with $500 to support the Canadians who are struggling to pay their rent. Again, much needed support for the people who need it the most. And that's not all, Mr. Speaker. We are moving forward to ensure that never again in Canada will a mother have to choose between buying groceries and taking her kid to the dentist. That is not right in Canada, and we are going to change that, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot more we're going to do, and we'll talk about it in a minute.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Joliette.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her speech. She spouted a lot of rhetoric, but when we look at the concrete measures that are in the economic statement, when we try to see what is new relatively to the spring budget, well, we can see that there isn't much. She has just given 2 examples, which are measures that were already passed before today's presentation of the statement. What I like in her speech is that she recognizes that we're in a financial crisis and that there's a recession coming, but what I'm upset about is that there are no new tangible measures to tell Canadians and Quebecers what the government is going to do to support them. For example, the Bloc Quebecois said, well, if we're heading into a recession, then we know that the EI system doesn't work, it's broken, and it's now or never. It's time to repair it before we hit a recession. But there's nothing announced to that end in the statement. And what about the increase in prices? What are seniors going to do, especially those aged 65 to 75 who did not receive an addition to their benefits? There are no new measures for seniors, and they can't make ends meet anymore. There are no tax measures either to incentivize workers if they want to, for example, seniors who want to work a few days a week. And finally, when it comes to health care, we know that all provincial and Quebec health systems, they're all broken. And in a few days, the health ministers are going to be meeting across the country with the federal health minister. But what are they going to discuss if there are no new measures? We were hoping that we would get the $28 billion and a firm commitment to have an increase of 6% per year. And they're going to meet in 4 days. But what are they going to discuss? Because there's nothing new in this statement. So we know that there are problems coming. We know we're in the midst of problems. But there are no new measures in this statement. So how is it going to work? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by underscoring that this is a fall economic statement. It's not a budget. It's a continuation of the work that we began in April and that we're going to continue to do. And I have a great deal of respect for the member across the way, but I would like to point out that we have already announced and implemented and delivered support measures that will make a huge difference in the lives of Canadians. For example, the GST credit. That is real support. What about rental relief? That's a real measure. What about the new dental care plan? That is real support as well. And I will be announcing new measures, major new measures, in the coming weeks and months. We understand that times are particularly tough right now. And for that very reason, our government will be there for Canadians with assistance for our students and for our most essential workers as well, because many of them are very poorly remunerated. So I think that's a very important measure. I think it's a targeted measure, and it's going to help people who need it the most. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are certainly some items that the Finance Minister has mentioned that are very familiar to us New Democrats, because they're the things that we have been pressuring this government into doing, whether that's dental care, whether it's the Canada Housing Benefit, frankly, whether it's child care, or many other things that we could go on about, including the GST rebate that's coming to Canadians tomorrow. But today was an opportunity to go above and beyond those things, to address the real challenges that people are facing as we come into a fall and they're worried about home heating and the cost of groceries. And as we learn that Loblaws is making $1 million a day more in profit above their latest banner year. So what we thought we might have seen, in addition to things that the NDP has required of the government to move on, were things like more serious consequences for price fixing in the grocery industry. We wanted to see a windfall profit tax so that these companies that are making extraordinary profits in the pandemic context are required to pay more in order for there to be assistance for Canadians. We want to see the GST on home heating removed, a measure that would apply across the country and not just in provinces that are subject to the federal carbon tax. We want to see that the government is now starting to indicate there may be a recession coming, except that they just reverted to the pre-pandemic broken EI system just as people are starting to worry about looking for work. Where is the promised EI modernization reform that the government has been talking about forever? And I also want to say I was very disappointed to note that the only reference to health care in this document is about dental care. That's a good thing. We should be moving forward on that. But at a time when most Canadians don't trust that if they go to the emergency room, they're going to be seen and helped, we need way more investment in healthcare, working collaboratively, of course, with the provinces. But we need to see that the federal government is willing to come to the table with those dollars. So on all these many things that this was an opportunity to take action on, why haven't we seen any action on those important issues?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first time that I've answered a question from the member for Transcona since the death of his father, who served honorably here. And I do want to start by paying tribute to him. He was a very important person for Canadians, for his constituents, and for progressive causes in Canada. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that this is a fall economic statement that will make a difference in the lives of Canadians. It will make a difference in the lives of the Canadians who need help the most. And Mr. Speaker, one of the themes in this fall economic statement is support for hard-working Canadians. And you see that in the Canada Workers' Benefit. We are moving this to an advance payment because people who work really, really hard for really low pay, They can't wait until the fiscal year is over to get that top-up. They need it while they're working. And I think they deserve it, Mr. Speaker. We should be rewarding them for doing those hard jobs and encouraging them to do it. So this is an important measure. I am really, really glad that it is here. And I want to say how much I thank all of those hardworking people who get the Canada Workers Benefit and how much I respect them. Mr. Speaker, there's another element in this fall economic statement which is directly about supporting hardworking Canadians and making sure there are great jobs for them. And that is that in our green tax credits, in the hydrogen credit, in the clean tech tax credit, we have included provisions for high-wage, good jobs and apprenticeships. That's the first time we've done that, Mr. Speaker. It will make a big difference.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we learned that the Costly Coalition would be introducing this economic update today, we had two demands. No new taxes on workers and seniors, and no new spending unless matched by equal savings. Today, this inflationary scheme triples the tax on home heat, gas, and groceries, and adds $20 billion of inflationary spending that will drive up the cost of living. And so, Conservatives will stand for the common people, their paychecks, their homes, their savings, and we will vote against this inflationary scheme. Quand les conservateurs ont appris que la coalition coûteuse allait introduire cette mise à jour, on a eu deux revendications. Pas de nouvelles taxes ou de nouveaux impôts, et pas de nouvelles dépenses, à moins qu'ils sont payés par des économies ailleurs. Et aujourd'hui, on apprend cette stratégie inflationniste augmente les taxes sur le chauffage, l'essence et les épiceries. Donc les consommateurs seront debout pour les Canadiens, pour leur chèque de paie, pour leur maison, pour leurs économies. Et nous allons voter contre cette stratégie inflationniste. How do we get here? Well, the cost of government is driving up the cost of living. $500 billion of inflationary deficits have bid up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest that we pay. Inflationary taxes have increased the cost of businesses, farmers, and workers to produce those very same goods. Now, Liberals will pretend that they had no choice but to double the debt. This Prime Minister will claim that it's not his fault that he added more debt than all previous prime ministers combined. Let's start with the fact that he added $100 billion of debt before the very first COVID case was ever discovered here in Canada. He can't blame COVID for that. In fact, he blew through his promise that the deficit would never exceed $10 billion. Well, it was already $100 billion in total before the first case of COVID. Then when COVID came, 40% of all the new spending measures had nothing to do with COVID, according to the Prime Minister's own named parliamentary budget officer. $200 billion of spending unrelated to COVID. And even amongst the COVID spending was an all-you-can-eat buffet of waste and mismanagement. They sent CERB checks to prisoners. They sent them to public servants who were simultaneously drawing public salaries. They gave wage subsidies to wealthy corporations that were rich enough to pay out dividends and bonuses to their executives, even after I warned that they should ban that hideous practice. They tried to give $500 million to the We Charity, an organization that had given $500,000 to the Prime Minister's own family. They spent $54 million on an app we didn't need, that didn't work, and that could have been designed in a weekend for 250 grand. The previous Conservative government had successfully delivered apps that were actually necessary and useful of a similar complexity for $200,000 or $300,000, but somehow this one went to 54 million. Many of the recipients admit they didn't do any work. They just hired other people to do work. So they gave the money to people who didn't do anything other than delegate the work to someone else. Don't we have public servants getting paid within the government to deliver those sorts of contracting? And now the government won't even tell us all of the identity of the recipients of that money. Yeah. So don't tell me they had to double the size of the national debt. Don't tell me that every dollar of inflationary spending was necessary. They were irresponsible and they were unnecessarily profligate with the dollars of Canadians, and now people are paying the price.
That's right.
Yeah. Now the Prime Minister will say, well, Russia caused the inflation in Canada. Yeah. Well, of course, we do less than 0.3% of our trade with Russia and Ukraine combined, beyond which the stuff they make is the stuff that we have here already. They have energy and food. We have energy and food. If only the Prime Minister would get out of the way of our farmers and energy workers and let them produce. Beyond which, under the previous Conservative government, there were wars. There was a massive war in Afghanistan, another one in Iraq and Syria, and we never had inflation anywhere over 4%. In fact, we were able to successfully contribute to defeating terrorists and tyrants in those conflicts while keeping the inflation level low here in Canada. We were able to get our spending under control and our budget back into balance. This government, by contrast, has spending today 30% higher than in the pre-COVID year 2019. Why? They said all the deficits were the result of COVID. COVID now is behind us and spending is still 30% higher, because we know that it is not COVID that has caused the costs to rise. It is a costly coalition and an irresponsible Prime Minister who have put these burdens on Canadian shoulders.
We all know that government spending today is 30% higher than it was the year before COVID. Why? Well, because COVID is not to blame for all this rising spending, exorbitant spending. What is to blame is a Prime Minister who has no control over Canadians'
plus que les Canadiens paient. C'est pour ça que nous avons le taux d'inflation le plus élevé depuis 40 ans. C'est la juste inflation.
And that's why we have just inflation, the highest inflation in 40 years.
Prime Minister also loves to blame all the cost of living rises on other people. Well, why is it then that house prices in this country are the second most inflated anywhere on planet Earth?
It's true.
Thank you. Why is it that land costs have gone through the roof? Land is not imported from Ukraine or Russia. Land is right beneath our feet. And we have the second biggest supply of it anywhere on Earth. And yet, Vancouver is the third most overpriced housing market on planet Earth, and Toronto the 10th. Can you imagine that? Two of our biggest cities have more inflated housing prices than New York City, than London, England, than countless other big metropolises that have more people, more money, and less land. In fact, Vancouver's house prices are more inflated than Singapore. Singapore is an island. Wow. They're out of land. Canada has more land where there's no one than we have land where there's anyone. So why is it that we cannot find a place to house everyone? Well, the first reason is that local government gatekeepers prevent housing construction by piling on massive delays that drive up the cost and drive down the supply of housing. This Prime Minister has had 7 years to stand up to the municipal and provincial gatekeepers that stand in the way of housing construction. But he would never do that because he does not want to confront the Liberal NDP radical left at city halls across the country that have made this problem worse. And so And so what he's done instead is continued to shovel money into their local bureaucracies to reward them for blocking the poor, for blocking the immigrants, for blocking our working class kids from ever owning a home. When I'm Prime Minister, we will impose conditions that if cities want more federal infrastructure money, they'll have to remove the gatekeepers. We will connect their infrastructure dollars to the number of houses that actually get built so that young people can find a place to live. And we will sell off 15% of the 37,000 federal buildings so that they can be converted into housing and our young people can have affordable homes. The second reason that we have such expensive housing and such expensive everything is because the Prime Minister engaged in a massive orgy of money printing over the last 2 years. Now, he said that money printing wouldn't cause inflation, right? Even though that's exactly what it has done every single time it has been tried over the last roughly 3,000 years, right? So here's how it worked. The Prime Minister wanted to be able to claim that he was borrowing all this money on the cheap. He loved to stand in the House and say that his debt wasn't costing any money because interest rates were so low. Well, the only reason he could borrow for next to nothing is because his central bank was creating the cash out of thin air. If it had been real lenders, they would have demanded a real rate of return on their loans. So what would happen is they created something called quantitative easing. Whenever they invent new incomprehensible terminology, Mr. Speaker, you can be sure that there's something sinister behind it. And here's how it works. Very simple. The government sells bonds to lenders. Bank of Canada buys back those bonds at a higher price. The lenders love it. That's why the banks thoroughly endorse this strategy, because they made the money on the difference. Simple arbitrage. The government sells them something on a Monday and buys it back for them at a higher price on a Wednesday. Who wouldn't go for that deal? Well, unfortunately, only about 100 financial institutions are eligible to participate in it. The rest of the ordinary, hardworking Canadians who pay for it are not. But the banks and the insurance companies and other financial institutions profited off of this transaction. Now, the Bank of Canada pays for those bonds by depositing money in the accounts of those large financial institutions held on reserve at the Bank of Canada. And so those reserves skyrocketed over the last 2 years, and as the bank bought up to $400 billion of new debt. And what happened? That exploded the money supply, and more dollars chasing fewer goods reached higher prices. Much of the money then funneled into the financial system and was lent out in mortgages to wealthy investors who saw a massive expansion in the number of real estate holdings they could accumulate. Thus, housing prices went up 50% in 2 years, creating the biggest housing bubble in Canadian history. And now that the central bank is forced to raise interest rates, it risks bursting that bubble. And all the people that got on the balloon when it was on the ground floor and it went up into the sky now risk coming crashing down as that balloon is bursting. And worse than that, the Bank of Canada now has hundreds of billions of dollars of deposits that it made into the accounts that it has on its reserves of those large financial institutions. Well, what's happened to those deposits? They now bear more interest because interest rates have gone up. So the wealthy bankers that participated in this arbitrage transaction at the beginning and were paid for it by having more money deposited into their accounts at the Bank of Canada now collect 3.75% because that is the policy rate that the bank pays. Now, what does that mean? That the central bank is now losing money for the first time in its history, and Canadian taxpayers are forced to bail them out to a tune of $4 billion every year. This entire wretched scheme, of which I warned 2 years ago, will maybe in the end amount to the single biggest wealth transfer from working class people to ultra wealthy insiders, from the have-nots to the have-yachts at any time in our history. Mr. Speaker, and now we see the painful consequences. It's not just about numbers on a ledger. It's about 1.5 million people forced to go to a food bank in a single month. It's about 1 in 5 people skipping meals or cutting portions because they can't afford their food. It's about the forthcoming winter, of which the minister spoke in metaphorical terms, who are now not going to be able to heat their homes as the cost of home heating is expected to double or even more for those people who are on home heating oil. It is about the 35-year-old living in his parents' basement, despite the fact that he did everything we asked him to do. He got a job, he got an education, he worked hard at every day, and now he can't afford a home, which means he can't build up collateral, cannot build credit history, cannot build savings for his future, and therefore cannot start a family. In Canada, a country with the most abundant, among the most abundant supply of land on earth, we can't find places for people to live. These are the real-world consequences of irresponsible decisions. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister sits and smirks at the fact that he took a $6,000 a night vacation to sleep in the fanciest hotel on planet Earth, staying up in opulent hotel lobbies, jazzing it up with his friends, while people back home cannot pay the rent. Canadians are out of money, and this Prime Minister is out of touch. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is, we're going to inherit this mess, all of us. Yeah. We're going to have to fix the problem. We have a big job ahead of us, don't we? Yeah, we have a very big job ahead of us. He'll leave a big mess just like his dad left. He'll be off on a beach somewhere surfing, and the rest of us will be busy working in here cleaning up the mess he left behind. The sooner that happens, the better it is. His own hotels, right? Because we won't be paying for them anymore. He'll have to pay his own way, like Canadians are today. So how are we going to clean up this mess? Well, for one, we're going to bring in a pay-as-you-go law so that every time we bring in a new dollar of spending, we'll find the savings to pay for it. You know who does that? Everybody in the real world. Everybody in the real world does that. C'est comme ça que les mères monoparentales paient leurs factures.
That's how single mothers pay the bills. When they want to take their children on vacation, they find savings, they make savings in order to pay for it. That's what small businesses do. When they want to spend more money on advertising, they find ways to save elsewhere in the business. That's normal. That's what people do. That is what people do in the real world.
Is the condition that faces every creature in the universe. If there's only so much to go around, every creature in the universe except for the Prime Minister just takes everyone else's money to pay for his own wants and desires. But we're going, in the real world, when people, you know, if a family wants a new deck, well, they might pass up on their vacation, or they find a deal on both the vacation, and maybe they pick up some used lumber at a local construction yard in order to save some money, right, so that they can do it all within the same budget. Imagine if instead of just piling on new spending all the time, the government actually had to find savings to pay for it. That would force the same real-world trade-offs.
Just going to interrupt the honourable opposition leader of the opposition. I thought everything was going very smoothly and very nicely. We're respecting each other. Let's keep up. Let's keep that up. And we'll let the honourable leader of the opposition continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not allowed to mention the presence or absence of the Prime Minister, but I will just say that some people bring happiness wherever they go and others bring happiness whenever they go. So we're going to cap government spending. We're going to get the Bank of Canada back to its core mandate. You know, for 25 years, the Bank of Canada had a very simple mandate: 2% inflation. Brought in by the Mulroney government, stick to 2%. Interest rates, money supply were all governed to that purpose, and it worked. It worked until this Prime Minister came along and pushed the bank to print cash to pay for his spending. We're going to have no more of that. We will fund our programs with real money, rather than printed cash, because we know that there are no freebies in this world, and we know that ultimately the taxpayer and the consumer pay for everything. We will reinstate that mandate, and we will audit the central bank through the Auditor General to make sure that never again is there such a horrendous abuse of our money as we have seen over the last couple of years. Instead of creating more cash, we're going to create more of what cash buys. We're going to grow more food, build more houses, and produce more resources right here in Canada. Here's how we'll do it. Here's how we'll do it. We'll incentivize our municipalities to remove their gatekeepers so that we can build more houses on the ground. We will remove the gatekeepers off the back of our farmers by canceling the tariffs and taxes on their fertilizers and on their fuel so they can produce more in this country. And we will remove the government gatekeepers that stand in the way of our resource sector. Do you know that in Canada today, we have the second slowest building permits of any country in the OECD? Second, the only worst country is the Slovak Republic. In Canada, you take all the types of building permits that exist, everything from a renovation permit on a house all the way up to a full uranium mine, and you average it out. In Canada, the average permit time is 250 days. In South Korea, it's 28 days. Wow. So you want to wonder why investors are taking their money to places like South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Ireland. Why? Because you can actually get things built in those countries. So that's what we're going to do in this country. We're going to compress the timelines and speed up approvals. We're going to challenge all levels of government to meet the goal of having Canada as the fastest place to deliver a building permit anywhere in the developed world. The minister said today she's going to go and pitch the world on our critical minerals. Problem is she can't get them out of the ground, right? She's going to tell everyone that they exist. Oh, you know, out there in that field, there's some lithium and copper and nickel. But if you have to wait 7 years for us to give a permit for anyone to dig that mine, she says she's going to give out a bunch of corporate welfare to mining companies. But those mining companies who can fill their bank accounts with taxpayers' cash, if they can't get a permit to dig the mine, they won't be able to turn it into anything other than big, fat boondoggles for taxpayers. So we will repeal the anti-energy law, C-69, so that we can build Canadian pipelines with Canadian steel that take Canadian energy to Canadian marketplaces and to around the world. We're going to eliminate the anti-investment taxes that pile on the back of our entrepreneurs so that it is actually rewarding to build things in this country. We are going to axe the carbon tax so that it's actually possible for our industries to compete and for our people to afford energy in this country. And as for energy, there are two very different approaches. Over there, they believe that we should tackle climate change by making traditional energy that Canadians rely on more expensive. We believe in tackling climate change by making new alternatives more affordable. We'll do that, yes. We will do that by incentivizing and speeding up permits to mine lithium, copper, cobalt, graphite, and other necessary minerals that will eventually go into Canadian-made electric cars and to other forms of renewable energy. We will incentivize the production of these energies here in Canada. We will incentivize nuclear energy here on Canadian soil so that we can power our economy emissions-free. And yet, oui, aussi, on va enlever la paperasserie pour les barrages au Québec. On sait qu'au Québec, ils n'auront pas assez d'électricité pour le futur des voitures électriques et pour les autres besoins d'un avenir vert. Mais leur solution, c'est de bâtir des barrages. Le Premier ministre veut empêcher ou retarder la construction de ces barrages avec une duplication des processus d'approvisionnement. On est d'accord avec le gouvernement du Québec qu'on n'a pas besoin d'ajouter notre 3-4 ans de délai pour ces projets-là parce que le gouvernement du Québec a déjà des processus pour protéger l'environnement. Les Québécois sont capables de protéger l'environnement et nous allons les aider en permettant la construction des barrages d'hydroélectricité. And finally, we will make this a country where work pays again. Right? It doesn't pay to work for a lot of people, whether you're on disability and you've recovered to a point, or you've arrived at a point in your life where you realize you could work 10 or 15 hours and you want to get out into the world and contribute. The clawbacks right now mean that many people on disabilities lose more than $1 for every extra dollar they earn. This government published a report showing that a single mother with 3 kids earning $55,000 a year who earns another dollar loses 80 cents on that dollar. So she earns about $25 an hour. She loses in clawbacks of her benefits and taxes on her income 20 of those dollars. So her real wage on that extra hour worked is $5 an hour. Nobody in Canada should be expected to work for $5 an hour. That is an outrage, and that is why my government will reform our tax and benefit system to ensure that whenever somebody works an extra hour, takes an extra shift, or earns an extra bonus, they are always better off. They always keep more of that dollar. We will do this to restore the Canadian promise. You know, I look around this chamber and I see many inspiring stories, like my finance critic who rose up today to ask the first question. The son of immigrants who grew up in a tough neighborhood with a difficult childhood, but was able to get a diploma in accounting, which he's putting to very good use in this house. He started a business, built homes, got elected to serve in a G7 parliament. I myself am the son of a 16-year-old unwed mother who had to put me up for adoption to two school teachers. But they always taught me that it didn't matter where I came from. It mattered where I was going. It didn't matter who I knew. It mattered what I could do. That is the country I want my children to inherit, and that is the country we will fight for every single day in this house.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister for Families.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that response because he was honest with Canadians, the Canadians that he's not going to be supporting through this fall economic statement. Right. He told them right away, students, for example, that he's not going to support the permanent elimination of interest on student loans. He told the lowest income workers that he's not going to support the continuation of the Canada Workers Benefit and making sure that they get that in advance. And he talked about incentivizing companies to invest in Canada, but actually in the fall economic statement, Mr. Speaker, there are really important measures that are going to help us build the economy of the future. But Mr. Speaker, this is very consistent with his actions to date, whether it's the Canada Child Benefit, whether it is the Canada Dental Benefit, the Canada Housing Benefit, whether it is supporting low-income workers and those most vulnerable in our country. He has consistently refused to stand up for them and to support them. Mr. Speaker, he talks a big game, but when there's actual action to do, he doesn't deliver. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, first of all, the Conservative government created what this government now changed the name to the Workers' Benefit. We created that benefit in the first place because we wanted to allow, along with increasing the personal exemption, to allow more and more Canadians to be off the tax rolls altogether and keep a bigger share of their paychecks. Furthermore, the child benefit, they wanted to take the money away from parents and give it to bureaucrats. We were the ones that put the money directly in parents' pockets. And you know, all they talk about today, they don't realize is something very simple. That the government can't give people anything without taking it away. The government doesn't have any money. First they try taxing it, which makes people worse off. Then they try borrowing it, which means that future generations are worse off. And then when they ran out of those two options, because they'd run out of other people's money, they tried printing the money, and now we have 40-year highs in inflation. You know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. Stop the insanity. Stop the inflation.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Terrebonne.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'énoncé économique mentionne plusieurs problèmes, comme le fait mention mon collègue député de Joliette. Mentionne les problèmes de chaîne d'approvisionnement, mentionne l'inflation. Il mentionne également une possible récession qui s'en vient. Malheureusement, ce qu'on a constaté rapidement, c'est qu'il manque de mesures concrètes. Le Bloc québécois, lui, contrairement au Parti conservateur, avait proposé plusieurs mesures progressistes pour pouvoir aider les Québécois et les Canadiens dans les prochaines années qui s'en viennent, qui vont probablement être rudes. On dirait vraiment que le gouvernement libéral fonctionne en silo. Non seulement il est imperméable par rapport aux mesures concrètes et constructives que l'opposition lui propose, mais en plus, on dirait vraiment qu'il travaille en silo. Deux exemples. On nous promet une réforme de l'assurance-emploi depuis plusieurs mois. Malheureusement, on ne la voit pas et l'énoncé budgétaire mentionne qu'il n'est même pas prévu dans les prochains 6 mois. Un autre exemple, le ministre de l'Industrie nous promet une réforme du Bureau de la concurrence. Encore une fois, l'énoncé budgétaire ne mentionne absolument rien là-dessus. Est-ce que le député de Carleton peut nous confirmer ou peut donner son opinion sur le fait que le gouvernement libéral semble vraiment déconnecté et surtout semble absolument ne pas travailler en équipe ensemble?
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Oui. Oui, le gouvernement est déconnecté, mais on ne devrait pas être surpris. On a un premier ministre qui dépense 6 000 $ pour une nuit, chaque nuit, à Londres, l'argent des contribuables. Lorsque les Canadiens ne peuvent pas payer leurs factures, lorsque les Canadiens manquent des repas, lui, il force ces mêmes gens de payer un hôtel de 6 000 $ par nuit. Hier, il a avoué que c'était lui dans la chambre fameuse de 6 000 $ par accident. Il a dit la vérité, mais par hasard. C'est la seule façon qu'on a la vérité de ce premier ministre. Mais c'est important, pas parce que 6 000 $ va causer la faillite du gouvernement du Canada, mais parce que ça montre que c'est un premier ministre qui est déconnecté, qui n'a aucune connexion à la réalité quotidienne des Canadiens qui travaillent fort, mais qui ne peuvent pas payer leurs factures. Nous, les conservateurs, allons rester debout pour monsieur et madame tout le monde, leur chèque de paie, leurs économies, leurs maisons, leur pays. Merci.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Speaker, and in the brief time that I have, there are two aspects of the Conservative leader's speech that I'd like to address. The first is his comments about home heating and the Conservative desire to remove the carbon tax on home heating. Of course, he'll know that New Democrats are prepared to work with people here across party lines to get things done. He and I, in fact, did that at the Finance Committee before he was leader in order to ensure that an iteration of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program wouldn't allow for the payment of dividends to companies while they were on the take. In respect of the wage subsidy. So we've extended our hand here a number of times in the House to say that while we support carbon pricing, we want to see an elimination of the GST on home heating. And we've seen Conservatives refuse NDP amendments to that effect. So I wonder if today here we might get a commitment from the Leader of the Official Opposition that he will work with New Democrats in order to take the GST off of home heating. And if I have a little bit more time, Mr. Speaker, I'd love to get into that second issue, which of course was his comments about building permits. Because building permits are a municipal issue. I'm glad he's taking an interest. I think that's important in order to address the housing issue. But I know that when it comes to workers' rights and the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause, he's claimed that because it's in another jurisdiction, he won't comment. Seeing as he's willing to comment on other jurisdictional matters today, will he get up and condemn the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
First of all, I'd like to offer the Honourable Member condolence on the loss of his father, who was indeed a wonderful gentleman. Secondly, on the issue of, he is right, we did work together to try and stop the government from giving tax money to companies so that they could spend it on bonuses and dividends for their wealthy executives. Third, on the issue of building permits, well, actually, it's not true that building permits are exclusively municipal. We have federal permitting for large-scale resource projects, and those, for large-scale resource projects do require federal permits. In fact, there are far too many projects that require federal permitting, and one of the reasons why we can't get pipelines and many other resource projects built is because of the immense delays that are imposed by the federal government on local projects. When we were in government, we made a rule during the Economic Action Plan: one project, one approval. Because prior to that, oftentimes the same consulting firm was hired to do 3 separate environmental assessments, delaying the project and driving up the costs. So we said one project, one permit. That's what we're going to do when I am Prime Minister, and that is why we're going to get more dams built in Quebec. We're going to deliver more Canadian clean, low-carbon, upstream oil and gas projects. We're going to deliver civilian-grade uranium, and we're going to have more nuclear energy, and other major projects are going to happen quickly and effectively. And finally, yes, I will attach conditions to federal tax dollars that go to municipal governments. These woke left-wing mayors keep telling us they're out of money for housing, but yet they're the ones driving up the cost of housing. If they want me to burden taxpayers by sending more money to their municipal governments, they need to get out of the way, remove their gatekeepers, and build more homes.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. A 1-minute question, and hopefully we'll have a 1-minute answer as well.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I do believe brevity is the soul of wit. I'll try to go faster than 1 minute. To the Honourable Opposition Leader, definitely comic timing is his forte. But my question is this. He suggested the Liberals have invented a complicated term called quantitative easing. Does he really believe the Liberals invented it? And if so, I urge him to ask Dr. Google quantitative easing, quotes from Jim Flaherty.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, in 50 seconds or less, please.
Google that, because Jim Flaherty was against quantitative easing. Yeah. Against it. And, you know, we specifically said we wouldn't do it, and we didn't do it. And we proved this nonsense today that this government had to do quantitative easing because the Americans did it. That's the excuse. The Americans did it in 2008, 9, and 10. They printed money like crazy. They ballooned income and wealth inequality as a result. Here in Canada, we said no. We banned our Bank of Canada from doing that, and as a result, we didn't have an inflation crisis, we kept our debts low, and we kept income inequality lower than they would have been. We can have an independent monetary policy. Our mothers taught us, just because all your friends are jumping off a bridge doesn't mean that you have to.
Reprise du débat, resuming debate, l'honorable député de Joliette.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Je vous dirais, Monsieur le Président, en commençant que, avec mes collègues, nous étions très fébriles cet avant-midi de nous rendre au huis clos pour prendre connaissance de l'importance de cet important énoncé économique. En tournant les premières pages, on était encouragés, on se disait, voici un gouvernement qui reconnaît les problèmes qu'on vit actuellement, à savoir la crise inflationniste actuelle, un problème à l'échelle mondiale qui a des répercussions réelles pour monsieur et madame tout le monde, arriver à boucler son budget avec moins de ressources, étant donné que les prix ont augmenté, prix de l'épicerie, prix de l'énergie, l'essence, tout ça, sans parler du prix du logement. Donc, la population qui fait face à des défis importants et le gouvernement dit, voilà, on est dans une crise inflationniste. Et même la ministre des Finances, il y a quelques jours, nous a dit, attention, aujourd'hui même, il y aura mon énoncé économique parce qu'on vit dans une crise inflationniste. Même chose au niveau des risques de récession. Encore une fois, c'est à l'échelle mondiale. La plupart des économistes, des analystes disent il y a de quoi s'inquiéter. Il se pourrait qu'on vive une récession en 2023. On le sait, la Banque du Canada, les banques centrales ont décidé de mener une lutte à l'inflation pour revenir dans la fourchette d'augmentation des prix entre 1 et 3 %, d'où la cible de 2 %. Et pour ce faire, elles mettent en place la politique monétaire qui est une hausse des taux d'intérêt. Mais qui dit taux des hausses d'intérêt dit ralentissement de l'économie par ralentissement de la demande, d'où le risque de récession à l'échelle mondiale. L'économie de ce pays fait face à un risque de récession pour l'année qui vient et ce gouvernement et la ministre, dans son énoncé, le reconnaît. Donc ça, on le salue. Or, plus on avance dans le document, plus on le retourne d'un côté puis de l'autre, plus on fait des règles de 3 en regardant les tableaux, les mesures, les chiffres qui sont annoncés, qu'on fait une comparaison avec ce qu'il y avait dans le budget du printemps dernier, plus on se rend compte que tout ça, c'est une bien belle rhétorique. Il y a une reconnaissance des problèmes économiques auxquels on fait face, mais quelles sont les solutions qui sont avancées pour y faire face? Eh bien là, Madame la Présidente, je dois malheureusement remarquer qu'on reste plus que sur notre faim. En fait, il n'y a pratiquement pas de nouvelles mesures qui sont proposées dans cet énoncé économique du dernier budget. On annonce que en 2024, il pourra y avoir d'autres mesures, mais aujourd'hui, maintenant, qu'est-ce qu'il y a de nouveau? Pas grand-chose. En fait, il y a un aide pour les prêts aux étudiants. Nous, ici, au Bloc québécois, moi, député de Joliette, je peux vous dire, ça ne nous affecte pas grandement, étant donné que le régime de prêt-bourse est québécois et ce qui est tant mieux pour les étudiants hors du Canada, mais pour les citoyennes et citoyens du Québec, quand on lit ça, on se dit, voici une mesure qui ne nous touche pas directement. Ensuite, le gouvernement dit on va dépenser davantage pour engager plus de fonctionnaires, pour être sûr, pour améliorer la prestation des services. Très bien, on a vu, par exemple, l'été dernier, là, la question des passeports, puis les exemples se multiplient. Il y a beaucoup de problèmes, des durées d'attente et tout. Donc, bon, voilà, mais ça reste quand même une dépense assez mineure, rien de majeur ici. Puis, évidemment, on rappelle les sommes qui ont été annoncées pour les gens de l'Est des Maritimes et de l'Est du Québec face à l'ouragan Fiona, qu'on salue aussi cet engagement-là. Mais tout ça est très mineur et très marginal. En fait, quand on regarde le document de l'énoncé, on cite plus d'une centaine de fois le mot inflation. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on apporte comme solution? On apporte les solutions qui étaient présentées dans le budget du printemps dernier où on faisait à peu près pas référence à l'inflation. Donc, on dit, il y a une crise inflationniste, donc qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On dit le mot inflation, puis on resserre ce qui était servi printemps dernier, alors qu'on ne parlait pas d'inflation. On sait tous, là, un de nos mets nationaux, en tout cas au Québec, c'est le pâté chinois, et on dit, règle générale, que c'est meilleur quand c'est servi réchauffé. Eh bien, c'est pas nécessairement le cas avec les mesures ici, parce que ce qu'on nous sert dans cette mise à jour, dans cet énoncé, c'est du réchauffé. L'essentiel des mesures qu'on y retrouve, qu'on voit, c'est du réchauffé. Donc, ça, il ne faut pas minimiser l'importance de la crise inflationniste actuelle, des risques de récession. Nous, au Bloc québécois, on avait interpellé le gouvernement en disant « prenez ça en compte et amenez des solutions concrètes ». Par exemple, on a un risque de récession, puis on a un système d'assurance-emploi. Si les travailleuses et travailleurs perdent leur emploi, s'il y a une récession, il faut qu'il y en ait un système qui fonctionne. Or, c'est connu, c'est reconnu par le gouvernement. Le système d'assurance-emploi est cassé, est brisé. Il fonctionne tellement pas bien que c'est à peine 4 personnes, 4 travailleuses et travailleurs sur 10 qui perdent leur emploi, qui ont accès. Depuis 2015, le gouvernement nous dit « Attendez, ça s'en vient, on va le réformer. Attendez, ça s'en vient. » Depuis 7 ans, on nous répète la même cassette « Attendez, ça s'en vient. » On s'attendait à ce que ça s'en vienne pour de vrai en septembre dernier, étant donné que les mesures spéciales de la pandémie prenaient fin. Eh bien non, on est revenu au vieux système Axworthy qui ne marche pas partout. Là, le gouvernement nous dit « Attention, ça va récession, parfait, c'est le moment là, de toute urgence, il faut réparer le système d'assurance-emploi. Il y a plein de consultations qui ont été faites. On sait exactement ce qu'il faut faire pour l'améliorer, le réparer. Eh bien, non, encore une fois, dans cet énoncé économique, c'est une belle occasion manquée. Le système d'assurance-emploi ne sera pas réparé, on laisse briser. Donc, on dit, attention, on fait un énoncé économique parce qu'on s'en va possiblement en récession, puis on on dit, ben non, on ne réparera pas le système d'assurance-emploi. Ça me fait rappel, donc ça me permet de partager tout à fait les propos de ma collègue de Terrebonne qui a dit, coudonc, est-ce que ce gouvernement-là travaille en silo? Est-ce que la ministre qui s'occupe de l'assurance-emploi a parlé à la ministre des Finances? Est-ce que ces gens-là se parlent? Ça aurait été le temps parce que c'était l'occasion de faire ça. Madame la Présidente, on est en crise inflationniste, les prix augmentent. Évidemment, les premières victimes de cette augmentation des prix-là, ce sont les personnes qui ont des revenus qui ne sont pas ajustés pour l'inflation, à savoir les aînés. On le sait, ce gouvernement a décidé d'aider les 75 ans et plus, mais a laissé tomber, a laissé de côté les 65 à 75 ans. Donc, ce gouvernement a créé deux classes d'aînés. Mais là, aujourd'hui, face à une augmentation des prix importants, les logements, les rénovictions, l'essence, le prix de l'épicerie, ben là, on a les aînés à faible revenu de 65 à 75 ans qui se retrouvent avec pas suffisamment de ressources pour pouvoir s'alimenter correctement, doivent se tourner vers des banques alimentaires et faire des choix déchirants et très humiliants. Eh bien, dans cet énoncé, étant donné qu'on reconnaît le problème de la crise inflationniste actuellement, c'était aujourd'hui qu'il fallait amener des mesures pour ces personnes-là. Nous, au Bloc, on dit ne créez pas deux classes d'aînés, augmentez tous les aînés dès 65 ans la pension de sécurité de vieillesse pour couvrir l'inflation et avoir un minimum de justice sociale. Eh bien, volontairement, ce gouvernement a refusé de faire ça. Madame la Présidente, je vais ici vous présenter mon hypothèse. Pourquoi est-ce que le gouvernement refuse d'aider les 65-75 ans? Je crois qu'ils se disent, nous voulons faire en sorte que les paiements ne soient plus suffisants pour que les personnes à faible revenu, la première catégorie des aînés que ce gouvernement a créé, 65-75 ans, qui n'aient plus assez de soutien public pour arriver à la fin du mois. Et comme ça, ils et elles seront forcés de retourner travailler. Donc, ce gouvernement, en 2015, se pétait les bretelles d'avoir défait la loi conservatrice qui repoussait l'âge de la retraite à 67 ans. Mais quand on regarde l'action face aux aînés, 65-75 ans, face à l'inflation, ce que je vois, c'est que ce gouvernement ramène une politique semblable par la porte d'en arrière. C'est-à-dire, on va s'assurer que les 65-75 ans n'aient pas de ressources suffisantes via les fonds de pension et tout, publics, pour joindre les deux bouts. Et comme ça, ils vont être forcés de retourner sur le marché du travail. C'est très hypocrite si c'est l'objectif visé. Et si ce n'est pas l'objectif visé, je ne sais pas c'est quoi, ce soit de l'incompétence crasse, mais je m'attends plus à une hypocrisie crasse de la part de ce gouvernement ici. Ça n'a pas de bon sens, c'est injuste. Souvent, les gens à faible revenu, quand ils arrivent à la retraite, c'est des gens qui ont trimé dur toute leur vie. Souvent, ce sont des femmes seules. Souvent, elles ont été aidantes naturelles. Elles n'ont pas de fonds de pension parce qu'elles sont restées à leur maison à élever une famille, à prendre soin de la famille et tout. Et ce gouvernement qui se dit féministe ne reconnaît pas cette part et les laisse tomber. Donc, ce gouvernement fait un énoncé, dit il y a une crise inflationniste, puis pour les premières victimes de cette qu'est-ce qu'il fait? Rien du tout. C'est déplorable. Donc, on devait retrouver une mesure comme ça dans cet énoncé. On ne la retrouve pas. C'est déplorable. Madame la Présidente, il y a la crise de l'inflation, de la hausse des prix, il y a le risque de récession, il y a aussi une autre crise majeure que vit nos sociétés au Québec, ailleurs dans les autres provinces, c'est la crise de la santé. On n'a plus accès aux médecins. Le service, le système de santé est brisé. Il a été mis à rude épreuve pendant la pandémie. Le personnel, les infirmières, tout le monde est à bout de souffle, au bout du rouleau, et le système est sous-financé. En fait, les problèmes ont commencé à arriver dans les années 90, quand le gouvernement fédéral à Ottawa a dit, nous, pour régler le problème de déficit et de dette, on va couper les transferts. Depuis ce temps-là, ça s'est mis à mal aller. Là, au lendemain de la pandémie, alors
And then
que
after the
au niveau des
pandemic,
taux de contamination, ça commence à revenir pas si mal.
when
Là, ce qu'on voit, c'est tout
things
ce qu'on a
started to
mis
get
de
a little
côté
bit
pendant ce
better,
temps-là.
well,
Tous les dépistages,
all
tous les
the
soins, les
screenings,
chirurgies
all
qu'on disait,
the
ça peut attendre un peu.
surgeries, all the
Là, ce qu'on se rend
health,
compte, c'est que ça ne fonctionne plus du tout.
the surgeries were
Les provinces,
simply
Québec, les provinces
stopped.
savent quoi faire. Les
And the
spécialistes,
provinces in Quebec
l'expertise
didn't
est
know
là,
what
ils
to
savent
do
quoi faire,
anymore.
mais il manque de ressources.
So there
Et
was simply
pourquoi
a
est-ce
lack
qu'il
of
manque de
ressources
ressources?
across
Parce
the
que
healthcare
Ottawa,
system. Why?
depuis belle lurette,
Because
ne
for
joue
a
pas
very
son
long
rôle.
time now, Ottawa has not been
Le
playing its
gouvernement à
rightful role.
Québec, les gouvernements des provinces disent
governments in the
Ottawa,
provinces and the
enfin
Quebec
là,
government,
il est temps plus que jamais
they
de
have
jouer
said,
votre rôle, financer
Ottawa,
à la hauteur
step
de
up.
vos moyens. Et ça, ces
Fund us
calculs-là, ces
to
chiffres-là,
the
c'est
proper
calculé
standards
année après
for our
année par le
healthcare
directeur
systems.
parlementaire du
And
budget
the
qui
PBO
dit
has said
c'est
this year
28
after
milliards,
year,
après ça
he
une
has
hausse
said,
de
there's a
6
gap
par
of
année
$28 billion.
pour couvrir
So the
l'augmentation
provinces
des
in
coûts
Quebec
et les
need a
besoins qui
6%
sont là.
hike per year
Ça,
to
c'est
cover the
criant,
cost
c'est
of
nécessaire.
healthcare. That
Face à cette
is
crise
essential.
de santé publique-là,
And,
le gouvernement
during
avait
this
le
public
rôle,
health
le
crisis,
devoir de
the government,
régler
the
ça
federal government has
aujourd'hui
a
dans cet
duty to fix
énoncé.
this now.
D'autant plus, Madame
And
la
it should have done
Présidente, que
so
le
in the
gouvernement
statement,
vient d'annoncer
especially since the
que
government
dans
has just
quelques jours,
announced that in
il
a few
convie tous les
days,
ministres de santé des
it's going to
provinces
invite
à
all
une
the
belle rencontre
provincial
avec
healthcare
le
ministers
fédéral
and healthcare
pour
ministers
discuter
from
des systèmes de
Quebec
santé,
to
pour discuter de
discuss
financement. Qu'est-ce qu'ils
funding
vont
the
leur
funding
dire?
of healthcare
Qu'est-ce qu'ils vont
systems.
leur dire?
What is the federal
Quelques jours à
government
peine
going to
après avoir
say?
dit, ben, on ne met pas une
There's
scène de
nothing in
plus
this
dans le système.
statement.
Alors
So,
que le besoin
what
est
is
là.
there to
Vous savez,
discuss?
Madame la Présidente, quand il
You
était
know, Madam
ministre de la Santé
Speaker,
à Québec, le
when
très libéral et très
the
coloré
very liberal
ministre
and very
Gaétan Barrette
colorful
avait
minister,
accusé ce gouvernement de
Gaétan
pratiquer
Barrette,
un
when he was
fédéralisme
in his
prédateur.
position,
Pourquoi il dit
said
on va
that
mettre
this
des
government
conditions,
practiced
mais on ne
predatory
financera pas
federalism. For
selon ce qu'on
example,
est
he
supposé
says
de faire.
the government put in place conditions
ministre
but
de la
doesn't
Santé
attach the
libéral avait
necessary
dit que
funding.
ce gouvernement
So
pratique
that
un
liberal minister
fédéralisme
said that this
prédateur.
liberal
Quand ça se chicane comme ça entre libéraux,
government
ça envoie le message clair que ça va pas bien du
practices
tout.
predatory
Le
federalism. So we
gouvernement,
can
la
see
ministre des
that all
Finances
is not well
avait
in the
une
liberal
occasion
family.
unique aujourd'hui de dire
So
on règle
the
ça,
deputy
on annonce,
minister, prime
puis on
minister
met la table pour la
had
rencontre
a perfect
parce que ça fait
opportunity
encore
to
une fois
say,
depuis
well, we're going to
2015
set the
qu'on dit
table for this
oui, oui,
meeting
on va le
by
régler.
attaching
Le
some
nombre de
funding.
fois que les élus du Bloc québécois se
But
sont levés
how many
en cette
times
chambre
have
ou
the
dans la chambre
Bloc
alors qu'elle était
Québécois
à l'édifice du
members
centre pour dire
How
allez-vous
many
faire votre
times have the members
rôle?
stood in
Toujours le
this
gouvernement
place
nous a dit
to
oui, oui,
say,
ça s'en vient, inquiétez-vous
increase
pas.
our funding?
Oui, oui,
The
ça s'en
government
vient,
says, yes,
inquiétez-vous
yes,
pas.
it's coming,
On peut
don't
croire
worry.
une fois, deux fois,
We
mais
might believe
pendant
that
7
once
ans
or
de temps, se
twice,
faire dire ça,
but over
donné,
7
ça
years,
suffit.
it's been happening
Qu'est-ce que ça envoie
constantly,
comme
and
message
now
au ministre
we're fed
de
up.
Santé des
What kind of
provinces
message does that send to
qui essaient
provincial health
d'organiser ça, ils
ministers?
tiennent ça à bout de bras, là, le système de
They're
santé,
trying
qui
to
craque de
fix their
partout parce qu'il a été
healthcare systems,
mis à rude
which are
épreuve durant la
collapsing,
pandémie.
which have been put
Et
through
puis
the
là, ben, on
ringer
leur
during
dit,
the
ben,
pandemic,
on va discuter,
and
mais
now they're
on vient de
holding a
publier les
meeting,
chiffres, puis il n'y a pas un sou de plus pour vous
and
autres
the
là-dedans.
figures have come out in this statement, and there's not a
C'est
single,
méprisant.
there's not
Ce
one more
gouvernement-là
cent for
qui se lève à
healthcare
chaque occasion pour faire la leçon
for this healthcare funding.
Toutes les autres, j'allais
It's
dire,
shameful.
les autres niveaux de gouvernement, mais même ils se lèvent pour faire la leçon au pape, puis ils font la leçon à un tel, à un tel,
stand
partout dans le
up and
monde,
they try
ils
to
font
teach
la
us
leçon,
lessons,
sauf que quand c'est le temps de s'occuper de leurs
but
affaires
when
à
it's
eux,
time
ben, ils
for
sont pas au
them to
rendez-vous,
play
ils
their
sont pas à la
role,
hauteur.
they're simply
On
not
le
there,
voit,
they're missing
le
in
système
action,
des passeports,
and
le système
for example, we've seen it with the passport system, with the
etc.
immigration
Tout ce
debacle,
à quoi ce gouvernement
everything
touche,
that
ben,
this
c'est
government
toujours un
touches
fiasco, il y a des
turns to
dépassements
dust,
de
it
coûts,
becomes a
puis le service
fiasco,
n'est pas là.
and
Puis là, ben, ils
the
font la
service is
leçon, on va
simply
vous
not
dire
there.
comment faire, puis on
And
met
then they
même pas
try and tell
d'argent.
us how to do things, but they
J'ai
don't
fait
provide any
référence,
additional funding.
Madame la Présidente, à
Madam Speaker,
l'immigration.
I referred to
ce que le ministre de l'Immigration a annoncé il y a quelques jours, à savoir des nouveaux seuils, une hausse des cibles de 25 d'ici 2025, en passer à 500 000 immigrants nouveaux arrivants par année. Bien, ça, c'est rappelé dans l'énoncé aujourd'hui. Ça nous inquiète. Pour plusieurs raisons. Mais je vais commencer par les raisons pratico-pratiques, les raisons pragmatiques. Nous, on dit que ces cibles-là, elles sont irréalistes. Ce qu'on voit là, dans nos bureaux de comté, on est submergé par les demandes d'intervention urgente parce que le ministère, ses employés n'arrivent pas à répondre aux demandes qui sont déjà là. On parle de délais épouvantables, on parle de papiers qui sont perdus, d'erreurs constantes. Et puis, donc, nous autres, ce qu'on dit, c'est avant de peut-être réviser un objectif, juste au niveau concret, technique, pratico-pratique, commencez à montrer que vous êtes capable de bien faire votre job actuellement, ce qui n'est pas le cas, et après on pourrait discuter. Ce gouvernement n'a pas dit une ligne, n'a pas fait un once de réflexion concernant la capacité d'accueil au niveau des logements. on est en pénurie de logements. Au Québec, partout au Canada, il manque de logements. Pourquoi? Parce que ce gouvernement, le gouvernement libéral à Ottawa, s'est retiré du financement du logement social dans les années 90, encore une fois. Puis, il n'y a jamais rien qui a été fait depuis. Oui, il y a eu quelques sommes récemment, mais c'est bien insuffisant pour les besoins actuellement. Donc, il n'y a pas assez de logements. Dans le secteur privé, il n'y a pas la capacité de créer, de bâtir des maisons, des condos, des appartements pour répondre aux besoins actuels. Puis là, on dit on va augmenter le nombre de populations de façon très rapide. On va les mettre tout ce monde-là. La crise des condos, des maisons qui sont plus abordables. Qu'est-ce qu'on dit aux jeunes qui veulent le rêve américain, c'est la classe moyenne.
They had this American dream, a middle class dream. They want a stable job and they want to be able to buy a house.
Ce rêve-là est brisé.
Les gens ne peuvent plus aspirer à se payer un logement dans leur vie,
à devenir propriétaire. Parce qu'avec l'offre et la demande, il manque tellement de logements face à la hausse de la population
there is simply no housing available, and the housing that is
ne sont plus abordables. Qu'est-ce qu'on leur dit? Puis là, on dit, on va encore accroître davantage la population de façon très rapide.
The government is saying, well, we're going to increase the population of Canada by bringing in new Canadians, but there's no place to house them. I gave an example of housing, but and this applies to schools
too. Pas d'arrimage là non plus au niveau de la santé. Donc, vouloir faire ça, c'est pas responsable. Et évidemment, pour nous au Québec, étant donné qu'on n'est pas un pays encore, le chef conservateur disait « quand je serai chef premier ministre, moi je dirais « quand nous serons un pays ». D'ici 10 ans, à mon avis, c'est réglé. On va travailler fort pour voir comment ce gouvernement et cette nation nous ignorent. On aura toutes les cartes en main pour prendre en main notre destin, évidemment. Mais comment bien intégrer, bien accueillir des chiffres aussi élevés si on veut avoir le pourcentage des cibles annoncées au prorata de notre population? C'est impossible. C'est impossible de garantir le maintien, le respect de la langue française. Même au Québec, on voit que ça recule. Là, quand on voit avec C13 les projets de loi du gouvernement qui veulent, dans le fond, rejeter les amendements qui feraient en sorte qu'on arriverait peut-être à protéger un peu mieux le français au Québec. Là, je ne parle même pas hors Québec parce que là, les chiffres se sont complètement effondrés. C'est d'une tristesse infinie, mais même au Québec, ça recule. Et là, l'intention de ce gouvernement, avec la complicité du quatrième parti en cette Chambre, qui va faire continuer à reculer le poids de la langue française, même au Québec, on n'a pas les outils pour accueillir convenablement dans la langue de Molière, dans la langue officielle du Québec, tous ces nouveaux arrivants. Donc ça, c'est un grave problème. Puis, c'est un dilemme cornélien, comme on dit, parce que si on dit on en accueille moins pour bien les intégrer, là, le poids du Québec va reculer très rapidement face à l'ensemble de la population canadienne. Donc, dans tous les cas, on risque de se faire marginaliser, puis c'est la survie même de notre culture qui est en jeu. Et comprenez-moi bien, Madame la Présidente, l'immigration, c'est une grande richesse. Accueillir les nouveaux arrivants, c'est magnifique. Sauf que dans la culture québécoise, on ne retient pas la politique du multiculturalisme qui est dans le fond, venez vivre comme vous vivez dans vos pays, intégrez-vous pas directement, vos petits-enfants le feront. Pour nous, c'est pas ça, c'est le nouvel arrivant. On veut pouvoir lui dire bonjour, on veut pouvoir échanger avec lui, on veut pouvoir gagner de sa richesse culturelle et on veut qu'il fasse partie de notre gang et qu'on puisse échanger. Et ça, avec les seuils qui sont annoncés aussi rapidement, ça ne fonctionne pas. C'est très inquiétant. Madame la Présidente, excusez-moi pour ce détour un peu plus long que prévu sur ce sujet, toutefois très important. Je reviens à l'énoncé. On disait sur l'assurance-emploi, la réforme, comme disait ma collègue de Terrebonne, la ministre de l'Emploi n'a pas parlé à la ministre des Finances, vraisemblablement. Mais comme comme elle le
speak
disait
to the
aussi,
Minister of Finance.
on dirait, quand on lit cet énoncé, que
But
le
it's as if
ministre de
when
l'Industrie
we
n'a
read
pas parlé
this economic
à la
statement,
ministre des
it's as if
Finances.
the Minister of
On
Industry
dirait,
didn't
est-ce
speak with the
qu'au
Minister of
gouvernement
Finance
libéral,
either. So we'd like to
la
know
façon
within the Liberal
de
government,
travailler, la méthode de travailler entre les collègues, c'est la méthode Apple, qui est de dire on va développer des politiques, des projets par silo. Les gens se parlent pas. Parce qu'on dirait que c'est ce qui arrive ici. Tout ce que nous dit dans les médias, en chambre, le ministre de l'Industrie et de l'Innovation, ben, on ne le retrouve pas dans l'énoncé économique. On ne le comprend pas. Donc ça, c'est vraiment problématique.
So that is very problematic.
En temps d'incertitude économique, ça prend de la rigueur, mais pas de l'austérité.
So we need rigor, but not austerity.
Il y a des mesures de soutien face à l'inflation, par exemple, les aînés de 65 à 75 ans. Donc ça, c'est très important, mais on ne veut pas d'austérité. Et on dit au gouvernement, recentrez-vous sur vos rôles fondamentaux. Les missions premières du fédéral, c'est quoi? Essayez de vous concentrer là-dessus, de bien les faire pour une fois.
Whatever it is, please do your job correctly.
Financer la santé, c'est un exemple.
Funding health, that's one example.
On avait été vraiment surpris dans le dernier budget au printemps dernier. Le gouvernement nous annonçait une quinzaine de nouvelles politiques, de nouvelles façons de faire, pour la plupart en santé, des intrusions dans les champs de compétences des provinces. Au lieu de se concentrer à bien faire son travail, ce gouvernement veut aller sur le terrain du Québec des provinces et empiéter dans les champs de compétences. Là, ici, on a encore un nouvel exemple. Le gouvernement annonce la création d'un secrétariat à l'emploi qui est encore une fois là au Québec. S'occupe de ça, ça va très bien. Ottawa veut s'en inspirer. Et évidemment, une de nos craintes, c'est dans cet empiètement-là, dans quelques années, plutôt que tard, ils vont mettre des conditions. Donc, ils vont avoir quitté notre modèle, puis après ça, ils vont nous dire, nous autres, on a notre programme, puis on ne sera plus capable d'avoir la liberté nécessaire qui nous a permis de mettre en place notre modèle qui nous a été inspiré du marché du travail allemand. C'est l'Allemagne qu'on a tiré ce modèle-là. Donc, encore une fois, des empiètements, au lieu de bien faire leur travail, de se concentrer sur leur rôle, ils continuent à déborder. Dans les médias, on annonçait là, que les rachats d'actions par une entreprise seraient imposés. On trouve la mesure intéressante, on a hâte de l'étudier. Sauf que dans l'énoncé, qu'est-ce qu'on voit? Ben, c'est annoncé pour 2024. Là, on est en 2022. Fait encore une fois, on n'est pas aujourd'hui, on est soit hier en servant du pâté chinois réchauffé, soit plus qu'après-demain, pas l'année prochaine, l'autre d'après. Fait qu'on pourra s'en reparler à ce moment-là, puis voir si le gouvernement va toujours avoir fait 6 fois la même annonce de la même mesure d'ici là, ou va avoir changé de cap. Donc, Madame la Présidente, vous êtes à même de le constater que c'est pas un discours qui va passer un énoncé économique qui va passer à l'histoire, le discours de la ministre tantôt, une belle rhétorique, des beaux principes, une belle reconnaissance des problèmes que l'économie vit, traverse, sauf qu'au niveau des mesures, des prises en charge, des actions que ce gouvernement veut poser, du pâté chinois réchauffé ou des trucs très lointains, puis le reste, ça reste très marginal. Il y avait une occasion en or pour régler des problèmes, prendre en compte la gravité de la crise actuelle. Ça n'a pas été fait. On ne peut que déplorer. Et j'incite évidemment la ministre à parler à ses collègues, à venir plus souvent au comité des finances, à être plus en contact avec les représentants de l'économie de toutes les sphères à travers le pays, sans jamais oublier le Québec. Ça ne pourra que lui faire le plus grand bien et peut-être l'inspirer pour avoir des mesures concrètes, finalement. Sur ce, Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie. Bravo!
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire pour le premier ministre et pour la présidente du Conseil du Trésor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, puis je félicite mon collègue pour son discours, sa réflexion sur le discours. Évidemment, je ne suis pas d'accord avec ses conclusions, même pas avec son analyse. Mais, Madame la Présidente, dans cet énoncé économique à l'automne, on a un bel exemple où on a un gouvernement qui est prêt à appuyer les travailleurs travailleurs canadiens qui sont dans le besoin, d'aider des familles canadiennes, des individus, incluant des Québécois, incluant des familles québécoises, incluant des gens qui sont vulnérables au Québec. Par exemple, est-ce que mon honorable collègue est contre le doublement de la TPS, le crédit de la taxe sur les impôts, sur la TPS qu'on peut offrir aux Québécois? Est-ce qu'il est contre? Il a parlé du fait que le programme des prêts aux étudiants, que ça ne relève pas du Québec. Mais, Monsieur le Président, j'insiste, et puis j'aimerais savoir si mon collègue, après a encouragé le gouvernement du Québec à emboîter le pas du fédéral pour éliminer les intérêts sur les prêts aux étudiants. Toutefois, que le gouvernement canadien a beaucoup contribué pour financer le système québécois. Alors, j'aimerais juste savoir si mon collègue va être d'accord pour ça.
L'honorable député de Joliette.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue. Comme je le rappelle souvent, c'est pour ma résidence secondaire dans la région. C'est le député qui me représente, donc je le salue. Je tiens à lui rappeler que doubler le crédit de TPS, c'est une mesure que le Bloc demandait avant le budget du printemps dernier. C'est une très bonne mesure. D'ailleurs, ça a été adopté à l'unanimité en cette Chambre. En comité, là, ça a été une rencontre. Le article par article a été fait. On n'a jamais vu un projet de loi qui a été adopté aussi rapidement. Donc, ça, si le gouvernement veut prendre acte de ça et s'en inspirer, bien, je lui dirais, plus souvent il va s'inspirer des mesures que propose le Bloc québécois, mieux ça va aller et mieux ça va être géré. C'est pas ça qui est ici, c'est que nous, on est prêts, des gens, des organismes, on dit c'est quoi la réalité, qu'est-ce qui peut être fait, et après ça, on porte ça au gouvernement. Et quand le gouvernement s'en inspire, tout le monde, il est content. Après ça, je vous rappellerai, Madame la Présidente, que l'éducation, c'est un champ de compétences des provinces. Je salue le fait que le Québec n'ait pas laissé aller ce champ de compétences-là. Et évidemment, comme je l'ai dit, c'est parfait pour les gens dans les autres provinces, les mesures qui sont là, mais ça ne concerne pas le Québec. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Bravo. Questions and comments. The honourable member for York-Simcoe.
And a lack of action on basic services. You know, when I travel through York-Simcoe, people are talking about the lack of children's Tylenol right now. Yeah. They're talking about lineups at airports. They're talking about passports. They're talking about a public service that has increased people by employees by 30% for worst outcomes. This government is failing us with basic services. And, you know, in my riding, when I go around, people are talking about 15, 18 months for a specialist. They're saying, Scott, I don't have a doctor. Now we have a dental plan that this government has come out with. And truly, people are saying, before we spend $1 billion on that, Scott, I would love a doctor. So I'd ask my colleague, why are they going around the provinces when there's already a provincial system in there? And if he could touch on the failure of this federal government on basic services.
Yes, good question. L'honorable député de Joliette.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son intervention et sa question. Tout à fait. Puis je dirais que, je pense, dans chacune des circonscriptions, la population vit des réalités similaires. Donc, ce gouvernement nous a montré qu'il était incapable d'offrir les services de base pour lesquels il est supposé devoir offrir. J'ai donné, je ne sais plus combien de fois, l'exemple des passeports, mais c'est un exemple qui a frappé. Après ça, comme mon collègue l'a dit, je pense partout, tout le monde vit le problème de crise de santé. Et il y a un lien direct qui est fait entre le désengagement de ce gouvernement qui ne veut pas financer la santé selon les capacités à payer établies par le directeur parlementaire du budget. Donc ça, c'est évidemment inacceptable et ça doit changer. Et bon, je vois, Madame la Présidente, que vous me dites que je dois conclure. Au niveau de l'assurance dentaire, au Québec, on a déjà une assurance dentaire et ce gouvernement n'a même pas daigné essayer de faire un arrimage ou de modifier de quelconque façon que ce soit le projet en comité. C'est une honte. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Et je veux remercier mon collègue de son discours. Puis je vais parler un peu au sujet de logement. On a entendu tantôt du chef de l'opposition officielle que des dépenses gouvernementaux ont contribué aux crises de logement. Puis je pense qu'il y a un argument plausible que ça met de l'huile sur le feu. Qui a été déjà là, même avant la pandémie. Mais nous savons bien qu'il y a beaucoup de monde avec beaucoup d'argent. Peu importe si le gouvernement arrête avec ses dépenses dans ce moment ou non, qui vont continuer à acheter des propriétés pour les louer aux Canadiens et Canadiens qui ont assez d'argent pour payer le loyer. Il y a quelques mesures ici aujourd'hui qui sont ciblées aux problèmes dans le marché du logement, mais ils présupposent tous que le logement est une commodité. Puis ils présupposent qu'on devrait utiliser des outils de marché pour régler ces problèmes. Ça ne parle pas de logement dans un contexte non-marché et les investissements dont nous avons besoin. Alors, est-ce que mon collègue pourrait parler un peu à ce sujet-là?
La députée de Joliette.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue Delmoud Transcona, avec qui j'ai la chance de siéger au Comité des finances. Et je peux vous dire qu'on travaille souvent en grande collaboration et c'est un plaisir de travailler avec lui. Évidemment, toute la question du logement, le problème fondamental, c'est au niveau de l'offre. Il n'y a pas assez de logements, condos, maisons pour subvenir aux besoins de la population. Donc, il doit s'en créer plus. Or, la capacité de création dans le secteur de la construction est insuffisante pour rejoindre les besoins et avoir un prix d'équilibre qui peut être acceptable. Donc, la solution, évidemment, aussi pour garantir que le prix demeure accessible, c'est d'avoir des logements sociaux qui soient bien financés. Ça, c'est 30 il ne faut pas que ça dépasse 30 le revenu des gens. Ce gouvernement se contente essentiellement, oui, un peu quelques exceptions, mais se contente essentiellement de financer le logement abordable, qui est un concept fourre-tout. Il doit recommencer à financer le logement social. Dans ces 31, les gens qui utilisent le logement social au Québec se trouvent exclus de l'aide. C'est inacceptable. Ça aurait dû être changé en comité. Ce gouvernement s'y est refusé. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Au milieu d'une urgence climatique et alors que les grandes entreprises pétrolières et gazières enregistrent des profits records, je suis sûr que, comme moi, le député de Joliette a été soulagé qu'au moins le parti au pouvoir n'introduit pas de nouvelles subventions aux combustibles fossiles dans cette mise à jour économique. Est-il aussi concerné qu'ils n'ont pas introduit une taxe exceptionnelle sur leurs bénéfices, ni complètement mis en fin aux subventions aux combustibles fossiles et investi dans les rénovations énergétiques profondes avec ces fonds? Merci.
Le député de Joliette a juste un petit peu plus qu'une minute pour répondre.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son importante question. La réponse rapide, c'est oui. Puis je tiens à souligner le fait qu'il a posé entièrement en français sa question. Donc, je le remercie. Bravo. C'est bien apprécié. Madame la Présidente, Radio-Canada nous rappelait cette semaine que le Canada, c'est le deuxième pays du G20 qui subventionne le plus les pétrolières. C'est inacceptable. Depuis 2015 que je suis ici, depuis 2015, ce gouvernement dit on va mettre fin aux subventions aux entreprises pétrolières. Encore une fois, comme pour beaucoup d'autres sujets, ce gouvernement a de belles paroles, mais ne pose pas les gestes, les actes à la hauteur. Dans l'énoncé économique, le gouvernement rappelle une mesure qu'il a présentée au printemps dernier qui concerne un crédit, une déduction pour les énergies vertes, sauf qu'au privé, pas au public. Puis là-dedans, il dit énergie verte, les petits réacteurs modulaires. Donc, des petites centrales nucléaires sur roues pour aller extraire du pétrole dans les sables bitumineux. Puis le gouvernement va prendre l'argent des impôts des contribuables pour soutenir ça. Ça, c'est ses politiques environnementales. Madame la Présidente, je suis très inquiet. Merci.
Resuming debate, the honourable member Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to all those assembled. I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about respect and what it means, because I think we're living in a time where people are finding it hard to feel respected. If you're working hard at a full-time job and interest rates are going up and the conversation you're having around your table is whether you're going to continue to be able to afford your home, whether that's because of mortgage payments or rent that continues to climb much faster than any possible justification for it, I think you feel like you can't get respect. People that are young people that are working in the economy, they're working at 4 or 5 different jobs in the gig economy trying to make a go, who are giving up on the dream of home ownership and wondering if they're going to be able to afford to buy their food as they try and figure out time to eat between the different jobs and the places that they have to get in order to work them, don't feel like the effort that they're putting in is respected right now. People facing layoffs and know that there isn't a decent employment insurance system to count on because some of the improvements that were there just for the last couple of years during the pandemic were taken away by the government in September, even as it begins to talk about the possibility of recession, or feeling like they're not getting any respect, that their government isn't there to put in place the kinds of things that they need in order to weather the storm. People living with disabilities that can't work at all or who can only work part-time. And I think, there's many people that, due to COVID, have had the experience of either not being able to work for reasons beyond their control or who haven't been able to get enough work. I think a lot of Canadians now know that pain, which is one that people living with disabilities in Canada have known for far too long. They can't get respect. And when they see that the meager disability pensions that various levels of government offer that have been legislating people living with disabilities into poverty for years, even before the pandemic, aren't going up in the context of inflation, it's hard to feel respected. If you're a senior that worked your whole life and you're now trying to make it on a fixed income that doesn't really grow, certainly doesn't grow at the pace of the extraordinary amount of inflation we've seen in essentials, you don't feel like the career that you had to fight for that pension and to earn that pension over time is being respected when it gets burned up so that companies like Loblaws can make another $1 million a day of profit. If you're an Indigenous person in Canada who's part of generations of people who haven't been able to access good economic opportunities and services at home, who find systemic racism and jurisdictional disputes getting in the way when they move to the city to being able to access those opportunities and services, that's not respect. And that's a long and ongoing disrespect that Canada has paid far too often to its Indigenous people. If you're a sick Canadian right now and you just need to go to the hospital, you need to take your kid to the hospital, your parent to the hospital, it's hard to feel respected when you walk in and you see the incredible need that is there and the fact that governments have not risen to the occasion to invest in the training and the employees and the infrastructure that we need in order to be able to deliver good health services. So on top of all the real financial distress that people are experiencing, I think there's also this tremendous feeling of disrespect, of working really hard, of doing the things that people can in order to make it, and that more and more not being enough, and the people that should be there to have their back and try and create structures and systems that allow people that are working hard in their own way to succeed aren't doing that job. And respect requires a few things, Madam Speaker. I don't pretend to have a comprehensive list today, but I want to offer up some of the things that I think are particularly pertinent to debate in this place and some of the policies that we could adopt here in order to make life a little bit easier for Canadians. Certainly one thing that respect requires is civility. We have to treat each other well. Respect requires that we're honest with each other. There's certainly a lack of that in this place far too often. And the third thing that I think it requires that speaks to some of the problems that I opened up the speech with are results. Because you can talk at people all you like, and if at the end of the day things don't actually get better, if there isn't actually material improvement that they can feel in their household budget, then it doesn't matter what we say in this place. At the end of the day, we're not respecting people if we're not coming to the table and working together to implement real solutions that are going to make a difference in their life. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about civility, which is something that we talked a lot, unfortunately, this year about because there's just such a pronounced lack of it. So it starts by us at least being able to, even though we disagree, we have some strong disagreements in this place. That's okay, that's what this place is for. But we need to do that in a way that respects that other people can have a different opinion and that doesn't make them demons or monsters or traitors or treasonous or whatever else, whatever other word you want to substitute in. Just because somebody disagrees with us doesn't mean that we should adopt a conspiracy theory that they're part of some kind of world movement to undermine everybody. Just because somebody disagrees with us doesn't mean that it's okay to promote the use of violence or to attack them physically. That's not okay. We've seen too much of that in Canada, and we've seen too much of it encouraged, frankly, in the kind of irresponsible rhetoric that too often finds its way to the floor of the House of Commons. Yeah. And so that's why, and I am going to disagree with some people today, and I'm going to be harsh in my criticism. That's okay. It's when it gets taken to the next level that it's a real problem, and I think it's a problem that's too present, and it's undermining Canadian democracy. And unfortunately, I think we're living in a time where that's not an alarmist thing to say. It's a truth that needs to be spoken. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to engage in what I hope is some meaningful and constructive criticism here today. I think we have to be honest with each other if we want to show respect to ourselves, to each other in this place, but to Canadians. And so I want to highlight some things, some issues where I think there is a pronounced lack of honesty about what's really going on. And that's important not just from the point of view of respect, but in the sense of just being honest for its own sake. It's important because if we want to get to that other part, the results, we have to be honest about what the problems are. And if we can't be honest about what the problems are and where they come from, or if certain political agendas are allowed to obscure too badly what the real causes of the problems are, then we won't get to the solutions and we won't get the results that we need. So we talk a lot about inflation in this place, and inflation is a real problem. That much is true, and that's honest, and you'll hear that from all sides. But if we want to get to tackling the problem of inflation, then I think some of the narratives around here are quite unhelpful. For as much as I think it's true that the liquidity that was offered to banks right at the beginning of the pandemic, just as it was under the previous Conservative government when the Great Recession of 2008 hit, even though I think it's plausible that some of that liquidity did pour more gasoline on the fire in our housing market, I don't think it's plausible to try and pretend that that moment in 2020 caused the housing crisis in Canada. How do we know that that's true? Well, anyone with a memory that extends back past 2020, which I hope is anyone serving in this place, will know that housing was getting more and more unaffordable then, and that it was breaking household budgets then, and that we've been on a trajectory for the last 20 years that has seen housing prices skyrocket. So just in the case of inflation in the housing market alone, it is simply not true to say that this is a new problem since 2020 and it's all been fueled by government dollars. In fact, the people buying up these properties are private actors in the housing market. And they were sitting on tons of cash before the pandemic, thank you very much, and also finding ways to buy properties in the housing market and make housing more and more unaffordable for people that don't have a lot of means so that they could rent those same places out to renters. And one of the places where this started was when the Harper government refused to renew the operating grants of affordable housing that was built in the 60s and the 70s. And that wasn't even the starting place. It was just another place you can go back to 2015 and a little bit earlier to see where real estate investment trusts started slobbering all over formerly affordable buildings that they could pay for with the money they already had in hand, mostly due to corporate tax cuts that were initiated in 2000 by the Chrétien Liberals and continued by the Harper Conservatives, that Jim Flaherty himself complained businesses weren't spending, reinvesting in real capital that enhanced Canadian productivity. Those piles of cash were being used to get into real estate. So let's not pretend somehow that public spending alone manufactured a housing crisis in Canada. It's not true, and we won't fix the problem until everybody in this place, including the leader of the Conservatives, acknowledges that. So let's have a little honesty about the root causes of that stuff. Let's all also have some honesty and recognize that we're in a time of serious global supply chain shortage, and that is driving a lot of inflation when it comes to the price of many things. People who've been fortunate enough in this time to purchase automobiles who have complained about the long wait. Well, that's because they can't get the chips from China, because China has a zero-tolerance COVID policy. So they often don't have workers in the factories that make the chips, partly because of the free trade agenda of Liberals and Conservatives alike that outsourced that work at the end of the 80s and the early 90s instead of building that stuff here. So it's a little rich to hear Conservatives these days talk about reshoring and free trade out the both sides of their mouth at the same time. Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about the role that corporate greed is playing in inflation. We've seen reports that say as much as 25% of the current inflation that we're experiencing comes from price increases that go above and beyond the cost increases that companies are experiencing. So that's a real thing. And when we look at the report about Loblaws today, and we see that mad money is being made by a number of companies, we see that profit happening in the oil and gas sector. We saw it with big box stores in the pandemic. We know that these price increases are being charged on the very market principles that Conservatives and Liberals alike love to defend, which is charge what the market can bear. It's why the government doesn't want to implement a windfall profit tax, because they think if you're in the right place at the right time and you own something that you can charge a lot for, that's good. That's what you should be doing. Doesn't matter if that's food, doesn't matter if that's socks, doesn't matter if that's rent, doesn't matter if it's a Nintendo, to them it's all the same. And what New Democrats have been trying to say in this place for a long time is that not all goods in the market are the same. There are goods that people can't do without. They are not goods. They're not wants. They're not desires. They are needs. And we should have a government that structures our economy to make sure that people can access the things they need and leave to the market the things they simply want.
That's right.
And that's a meaningful difference. I think we need a little honesty in this place when it comes to what it means to defend the rights of workers. Because we have a leader of the opposition that gets up all the time and pretends that he's defending workers. I remember that he was part of the government with Bill C-377 and 525 that was a direct attack on workers' ability to organize, and I have noticed his pathetic silence when it comes to the Conservative government right now in Ontario preemptively using the notwithstanding clause in order to deny the collective bargaining rights of workers. And I find it difficult to see the Prime Minister pretend to be a champion for those same rights when I watched in this place as his government introduced and railroaded through, with the help of the Conservatives, back to work legislation for Canada Post workers and workers at the Port of Montreal. So if he's upset just that the Ford government preemptively used the notwithstanding clause, you can be sure he doesn't have an objection to taking away collective bargaining rights by legislating people back to work. Let's have some honesty about that in this place as well. One of the ways that we could help people is by removing the GST on home heating. That's a long-standing NDP position. I thought maybe we'd find some help from the Conservatives, but they're obsessed with the carbon tax. Well, let's have a little honesty about the fact, first of all, the carbon tax doesn't apply everywhere in the country. BC, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, the Northwest Territories all have their own carbon pricing system. Removing the federal carbon tax from home heating won't do a whit for people who are concerned about the cost of home heating in those provinces. Maybe the provincial or territorial government will do that, but it sure as heck ain't going to happen here. What would help everyone across the country is if we removed the GST on home heating, because that does apply all across the country. It's why it's a better solution. It's why we proposed it in an amendment to a Conservative Opposition Day motion that presumably was about affordability and helping people, and they said no. Why? I'm not going to take that as their permanent answer, because I believe that we have to believe here that people can come to their senses and make better decisions. It's why I asked the leader of the Conservative Party just earlier this day, after his remarks on the fall economic statement, if he would join with us in order to work to get rid of the GST on home heating, and he dodged the question. He never once mentioned the GST in his answer. I found that passing strange. The Liberals are inadequate on this. They should have done something about this in the fall economic statement. It was a clear opportunity to get something done in a time where, yes, they have done some things to help. I'm going to give them that. What have they done to help? Well, they talk about dental care so that children can get access to dental services. For some of them, it'll be the first time in their life. They talk about the Canada Housing Benefit, another $500 a month for low-income renters. They talk about the GST rebate that's going to be rolling out tomorrow, a doubling of the GST rebate for the next 6 months. They talk about investments in childcare. Those are all good things. I remember those things. I remember when we first raised those things and got laughed at by the Liberals, whether it was on the GST rebate, because we didn't need that, the economy's roaring, everything's fine, this inflation is just transitory. I remember running in 2015 on a national child care strategy. I remember the Liberals running against it. And we kept up the pressure. We kept talking about it. We went out. We talked to Canadians that need childcare in order to be able to go to work. We knew we weren't going to drop the file. We kept pushing until the Liberals came to their senses. I remember just about 18 months ago when the Liberals stood up with the Conservatives in this place in a previous parliament to vote against dental care. Yep. And it was through the power of our 25 votes in this parliament that we held them over the barrel and are getting them to actually get it done. So yes, I'm quite aware of some of the things that the Liberal government is doing in order to bring help Canadians. I'm also quite aware of the extent to which those things would not be happening if Canadians in their wisdom hadn't elected a minority parliament and given New Democrats the opportunity to fight for the things that we've always said we would, and that is exactly why we are fighting for those things.
That's right.
One of the things that's in the fall economic statement that, again, has been something, it's in the supply and confidence agreement, is a pandemic dividend. What is that? This time, it's actually a dividend that comes back to Canadians instead of Canadians paying for the dividends that go to shareholders. It's on banks and insurance companies that made record profits during the pandemic. It's a one-time payment of some of those enormous profits back into the coffers of the Canadian government, not so that it's in the pocket of the government, but so that it goes out in the form of the GST rebate and the dental benefit and the Canada Housing Benefit. That's something that we fought for, including a permanent 1.5% hike on the corporate tax rate for those very same financial institutions. I was glad to see the elimination of student loan interest permanently in this economic statement. That's something I've watched New Democrat MPs get up for the last 7 years that I've been here and talk about, and again, get laughed at by folks on the government benches, and it's because we're here and it's because we're pushing that we see things like that in the fall economic statement. I want to talk a little bit about housing again. There are a few initiatives here. There's a anti-flipping tax, there's a doubling of the first-time homebuyer tax credit, which is something New Democrats have advocated for. But I'll say that these measures are still part of that market-based approach to housing that I believe we really need to move past if we're going to find a solution to the crisis in housing. We have to invest a lot more in non-market housing, and that has to be the priority. If the government isn't going to challenge the culture of housing as a commodity, which it could do by moving on real estate investment trusts, which it could do by buttressing the position of nonprofits that want to build non-market housing. Unfortunately, one of the needs there now is just to cover the difference that interest rates have made for projects that are on the books that now can't go ahead because interest rates have changed the math. If government would come to the table to help them acquire buildings and land quickly when they're having to compete with these REITs, that would be helpful. If they would come to the table to say, we're going to cover the difference in your business plan for your nonprofit housing that you're suffering because of higher interest rates, that would be something that would help. They also need to get serious as part of that, and I want to give a shout out to my colleague from Vancouver East from Question Period earlier today, who was talking about the need for a meaningful and well-funded urban Indigenous housing strategy. The government talks a big game. They want to say that a $300 million investment is a record investment. I think if that's true, what a shameful testament to Canadian history that Indigenous people living in urban centres haven't been able to access more funding for affordable housing far sooner. And it's the kind of thing that we need, but that again is outside the market framework that largely dominates liberal thinking about the housing space. And if we can't break out of that, we're never going to make the difference that we need to make for Canadians in these challenging times. So I've talked a little bit about some of what is in the fall economic statement, but I want to spend some time talking about what's not in it. And as I said earlier, I mean, we're in a very challenging moment as a country. And for all of the things that New Democrats have fought for, some of which the government is doing, some extra things that the government is doing, like the 2% tax on share buybacks, which I think is a positive measure, and I'm glad to see. I don't think it's going to make all the difference. It has to be part of a bigger package. But in addition to those things, there are many other things that really ought to have been here, and that an NDP government would have been keen to put in our own fall economic statement. Consider the question of employment insurance, Madam Speaker. The government just today is starting to talk about a recession in the offing. But just a couple months ago, they took an employment insurance system that had been made better, not perfect, but better during the pandemic. It was easier to qualify for benefits. There was actually a benefit floor. So if you're a part-time worker or somebody working a couple part-time jobs and it's hard to get all the hours, and 55% of your income from those jobs that you've been cobbling together isn't enough to live on, we actually had an income floor so that when you're laid off, you could hope to be able to pay the rent. All of that went by the wayside on September 24th. It's just gone. And we've been saying for years during the pandemic that when those rules expired, when the government was ready to let them expire, that they had to be replaced with meaningful structural reform to the employment insurance system, and that in no way should they let those new rules lapse, because those rules were a lot more on the way to a functional employment insurance system than anything that we had before. So at the very least, they could have kept that in place until they came with their new fix. We still haven't seen what that new fix is. There are rumors about maybe them acting on it this fall. Well, I sure as heck hope so. Because if the rumors about recession in early 2023 are true, people are going to need that employment insurance to be there for them. And only about 4 in 10 working Canadians before the pandemic qualified for employment insurance. That's why it was such a broken system. So we have to find fixes to that. And I had hoped at least that there might have been a reference or a hint as to what the government has in mind for how to fix that system. I was also disappointed to see that the only reference to health care in the fall economic statement was dental care. I'm glad that dental care is there, but man, is there ever a lot more that we need to do. The provinces need more funding for health care, and I believe, as New Democrats do, that the federal government can play a positive role in convening provinces to talk about best practices, to develop a human resources strategy that isn't based on some provinces poaching people that other provinces train, but to have a truly national training strategy where the provinces participate on their own terms, but somebody's got to bring them together in order to have those conversations and to make that happen. And there's a role for the federal government to play there. And we need to acknowledge that a big problem in our healthcare system right now is just not enough trained people available to do the job. That is a national problem right now, and it requires a response with every part of the country working together arm in arm to figure out how we meet that challenge, and it is going to require federal funding to be sure. Not a word about that, and yet that is the reality that so many Canadians are living as they go to hospitals, including the 350 people who are dying from COVID every week still in Canada and are going to the hospital before their death seeking help and finding that they have to wait for hours if they're lucky, days if they're not, in order to get service. How do we pay for many of these things? Well, I talked earlier about a windfall profit tax. We know there are companies that can't afford to pay more and ought to be paying more. This is not a time where we should be tolerating exceptional profit well above pre-pandemic levels without asking those same companies to pay a little bit more on that extra profit. It doesn't make sense, because that is some of the money that Canadians are giving up due to higher prices, and we need that money in order to bring the cost of those essential things down. So I would like to think, I hope others will agree, that that was a pretty honest talk about some of the problems that we're facing. I don't expect that everyone's going to agree on some of the solutions that New Democrats are putting on the table, and fair enough. That's what we're here to do. We're here to put ideas out there. We're here to debate them. I hope we're here to find common ground as best we can in the course of debates like this, to be able to move ahead on important measures, like, for instance, removing the GST from home heating as we prepare to go into another cold Canadian winter. So I offer, as I say, what I hope is an honest analysis of the problems that we face, and I've tried to offer some solutions that I think it would behoove the government to take up. And we stand ready to work with anyone in the House who wants to talk about these solutions or propose other good ones that we haven't thought of yet in order to make life better for Canadians as they stare down a very difficult fall and beyond. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du Premier ministre et de la présidente du Conseil du Trésor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Puis j'aimerais remercier mon collègue de Winnipeg pour son discours, puis aussi pour démontrer aux Canadiens les atomes crochus avec l'annoncé économique à l'automne. Et puis aussi, c'est différent. C'est important que chaque parti ait la chance d'expliquer où ils se trouvent en accord, ce terrain d'entente entre leur formation politique et puis la mienne. J'aimerais demander une question très limpide, peut-être très courte, à mon collègue de Winnipeg. Est-ce qu'il trouve qu'il y a assez dans cette entente, dans cette annonce énoncée, qu'il va voter pour cet énoncé de la ministre des Finances?
L'honorable député de Elmwood-Transcona.
Et je pense qu'une des importantes considérations quand nous parlons des votes de confiance, c'est toujours est-ce que les Canadiens et Canadiennes seraient mieux servis par une élection coûteuse en ce moment-ci? Et la réponse est non. On va voter pour la motion demain pour assurer qu'on peut continuer ici de faire le travail qu'on devrait tous faire pour mettre en œuvre des vraies politiques qui vont vraiment aider aux Canadiens et Canadiennes pendant ces temps difficiles et ne leur pas demander de participer et d'écouter à une élection comme alternative. Alors, merci.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Moose Jaw. Hold on here. I just want to make sure I get it right. Yeah, Moose Jaw, Lake Central Lanigan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, Madam Speaker, I used to fly airplanes, but I know a little bit about sailing. And one of the things that you want to do is you want to keep the water out of the boat. But what seems to be the policy right now with this Liberal government is throwing water into the boat and drowning Canadians. So I'm going to ask my colleague, who's just spent a bit here on this fall economic update, is he willing to vote against this budget and actually campaign on their own terms and put their own budget compared to what this one has been? Thank you.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, when an election comes, we will be campaigning on our own terms, just as we work here every day on our own terms to advance the things that we committed to the people who voted for us that we would advance in this place. And we're doing that to the best of our ability and rather effectively on a number of items, I would say. That's right. When it comes to, inflationary spending, I would say, look at the GST rebate. That's targeted at people who have the least amount of money in the country, who have seen extraordinary increases in the price of groceries and rent. That money isn't going to chase more goods. That money is going to try and keep their boat afloat and just buy the things that they used to buy. So the idea that somehow doubling the GST rebate is inflationary is simply false. The poor are not driving inflation in Canada. And if the goal of government policy is to help them get through these difficult, trying times, it won't be contributing to inflation.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
Merci, Mme la Présidente. J'aimerais féliciter le député d'Elmwood Transcona pour l'ensemble de son discours, mais j'aimerais particulièrement lui parler de la première partie de son discours où il nous a parlé de respect. Et c'est un élément important parce qu'on est ici pour débattre des idées. Et puis, vous savez, on a tous des convictions ici. On est porté par une idéologie possible, mais on a des convictions. Mais le propre d'une conviction, lorsqu'elle est brute, c'est de ne pas tenir compte des conséquences de la conviction en question. Et ça amène des débats qui sont stériles. Maintenant, c'est sûr que si on monte un peu les idées, on arrive à une étape qu'on appelle celle de la responsabilité, qui est justement de se préoccuper des conséquences des convictions. Mais ce qu'il a fait plutôt, le député, c'est de franchir un autre pas pour aller vers un élément qu'on appelle, nous, l'éthique de la discussion, c'est-à-dire baissons les armes un peu. Ayons du respect les uns pour les autres. Faisons la promotion de nos idées, mais soyons civilisés. C'est ce que j'ai entendu dans la première partie de son discours. Et j'aimerais lui poser la question suivante. Quels sont les risques de ne pas promouvoir le respect et de dériver vers de moins en moins de civilité? Merci.
L'honorable député de Elmwood Transcona.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Je pense qu'on voit un peu ces conséquences. On les voit ici au Canada, mais on les voit autre part aussi. Je pense particulièrement des États-Unis, où il y avait une attaque sur la capitale même et leur législature nationale. Ça, c'est un problème très, très grave. Puis, je pense que c'est la démocratie est quelque chose qui est en anglais, on dit achievement.
In English, we say it's an achievement.
Mais c'est quelque chose qu'on doit toujours refaire pour nous-mêmes.
It's something that we always have to do for ourselves. It's not something like a box
ou un crayon ou quelque chose qu'on peut avoir comme objet
that we can hold like an object
pendant le temps.
a concrete object that remains the same over time. An achievement is something that we have to do ourselves, we have to work at it ourselves, and if we abandon our democratic culture, and if we lack respect for differences, then we're going to lose our democracy.
Dans des circonstances non démocratiques,
have a great deal of success in undemocratic contexts, will take up more and more room and more power.
Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by thanking the member for Elmwood Transcona for showing members in this place that it's possible to vigorously and passionately disagree while still being respectful of other people. And I think if we had more of that here, Canadians would be better served by members in this place. And so I thank him for his contribution in that way. My question is that he was able to also point out both areas where money can be saved. For example, if we were, and revenue could be generated for government if we were to properly tax real estate investment trusts, for example, as well as speaking about the important needs that Canadians have. For example, Canadians with disabilities who are crying out for emergency supports while living in legislated poverty. Can he speak more about the important connection between both the dollars that are needed to be raised in order to fund the investments that are required to meet these important needs?
Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm certainly happy to do that. I think, you know, we need to see in this time where we see companies making extraordinary profit well beyond what they were making pre-pandemic in a time of massive need. That's a lost opportunity to ensure that people that are struggling, who don't have the extra money in the bank account, can continue to do well. And that is important from a moral point of view, but it's also important from a financial point of view. Allowing large corporations to accrue larger and larger surpluses to pay out to their already rich shareholders it means that the people that don't get the help and support they need, that end up homeless, that don't get access to health care, end up in emergency rooms, end up on the street, end up in the justice system, end up in difficult circumstances that are themselves very costly to remediate. Everyone ends up worse off, and that's why having a fair tax system with proper investments in people who need that investment is a smarter way financially over the long term too.
That's right. For a brief question, the honourable member of Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The member actually raised the issue around housing, and he's exactly right in the sense that housing costs went up over 70% under the Harper government and by another $300,000 under the Liberals. Now, on urban Indigenous housing, in my own riding, we're the third largest urban Indigenous community in the country. The $300 million that's been committed will not even address the housing crisis in my own riding. The PBO actually said that we're short over $600 million to meet that gap. So my question to the member is this. How could it possibly be that the Liberals refuse to see reality? Why are Indigenous people's lives are always put in the back burner?
A brief answer for the member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, and I think the member for Vancouver East makes an excellent point. I can't speak to why this continues to be such a, blind spot of the government. A blind spot is putting it too lightly because it's a desperate need, and it's an issue of justice for Indigenous people in Canada that they should have the right, which everyone in Canada should have, to a decent home, and that is going to require investment. And you can tell that $300 million, if you do some quick math, which I'd be happy to do at a future time, Madam Speaker, because I see him out of time, is not going to build enough units to get the job done.
That's right. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci à tous mes collègues ici.
And I'd like to thank all my colleagues here in this House.
Le Parti conservateur, puis aussi les libéraux, puis aussi le Bloc
to
Quebecois,
thank the Liberals, the Bloc, the Conservatives, the NDP. They've decided to give the Green Party of Canada the opportunity to rise and speak in this House, and I'm very grateful. So I'd like to thank all of them very, very much. We have now heard the fall economic statement 2022. It's not a budget. We're looking then, we've had a foretaste of what budget 2023 might look like, and the Minister of Finance has given us a glimpse of the trends that are to come.
I think what we see here is an honest assessment, more honest than many finance ministers, in saying things aren't going to be great very soon. C'est important d'être honnête. C'est important de faire face à la réalité économique parce que ce n'est pas seulement nous, Canadiens, qui doivent faire face à la réalité des problèmes mondiaux. Nous avons les problèmes mondiaux et c'est la croissance des coûts de toutes les choses, presque toutes les choses quotidiennes.
Everything is costing more and more.
À mon avis, ce n'est pas l'inflation.
In my opinion, it's not
I
inflation.
want to say that what we're facing now, and I think the Minister of Finance was honest in saying, as was the Department of Finance, we're not looking at economic growth in the next couple quarters. We're looking at a slowdown. And yes, the minister has said we have a good house, we have a good roof. Those are good things, but we are facing unprecedented global challenges. And I think in looking at this statement, I'm going to be as nonpartisan as I can possibly be in saying that we've got some new indications here that suggest a growing awareness of something that I'm going to say probably more boldly or baldly than other politicians will say. So first, let me just go back and say there are some good news pieces to this budget, some less good news, some missed opportunities, I should say. I really would have hoped to see a tax on the windfall profits of enormous oil and gas and other fossil fuel enterprises. They have been clearing in the billions of dollars every quarter what has been described by others, not just certainly the Secretary General of the United Nations. These windfall profits are not due to the economic wisdom, the genius of those in the fossil fuel industry who know how to ready their industry for great success. Let's be clear, this is because of Putin's war in Ukraine. This is war profiteering. No sector, no CEO should be proud to be able to return profits to shareholders because of war profiteering. They should not be proud to do that when they're raking in unprecedented levels of profit and Canadians are suffering. That's something of which no business CEO should be proud. I'm from the Maritimes. I'm friends with the Irving family, so forgive me if I mention the Irvings, who not only are the only refinery in Canada that imports Saudi Arabian oil, have also experienced windfall profits, and it turns out from today's news, figured out a way to avoid paying taxes in Canada through a bit of a shell game with their own insurance company offshore. Well, Canadian corporate leadership needs to be able to look itself in the mirror and say, what are you doing for Canadians? All of you. And I think the Minister of Finance missed the opportunity today to set a course that says, if you're experiencing windfall profits, be you in the fossil fuel sector, banking or insurance, and banking insurance have had some increase, but not sufficient to really deal with the excess profit problem. If you're dealing with a handful of Canadian families who hold a great percentage of Canadians' wealth, shouldn't we be looking at a wealth tax? Because when a government says we see that rough weather is ahead, we see that Canadians are going to be facing increasing costs for many things, shouldn't we right now be saying we need additional revenue to be able to ensure that those who are suffering the most from this can pay their rent, can cover their mortgages, take their kids to the grocery store and not the food bank? How do we make that possible? Well, it's not from trickle-down economics that the economy is going to do so well in a year or two or three that that's going to lift everybody up. We know that story. The rising tide, they said, will lift all boats. Trickle-down will work. Well, we know how it works. The rising tide lifts all yachts. Doesn't lift all boats. And we know that people are going to need help with their own little boats very soon. Another place to have more revenue is to stop spending money on hand over fist handing billions of dollars, particularly to a sector that we know is responsible for us having to spend hand over fist other billions of dollars in the climate crisis. We have promised in this country, since Stephen Harper was Prime Minister in 2009, he was at a G20 summit, I recall.
The honourable member has a point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'd like to point out that there's no quorum.
Just a moment. I'll just double check on virtual as well. So I really appreciate the honourable member rising on a point of order. We're going to ring the bells to get the quorum into the House.
Climate, that the financial sector lines up and aligns with climate goals. But back to what I was going to be saying before, Madam Speaker, when we look at the situation in which we find ourselves, Canadians do need help in the short term. The source for that help must be by going after the excess profits of large sectors such as the fossil fuel sector, such as the financial sector, the banking and insurance sectors, and indeed grocery store chains if it can be established that those are indeed excess profits, as has been alleged so very effectively by colleagues in the New Democratic Party. We do know that there are things that we can do to weather storms by taking care of each other. In looking at this financial update, I think it's very notable. Je pense que c'est la première fois que quand j'ai lu quelque chose préparé par le département de finances, il est clair que la crise de changement climatique ne reste pas comme en passé comme un enjeu environnemental où on doit avoir des fonds. Non. Dans cette, pour la première fois, cette annoncé économique de l'automne,
this fall economic statement,
dont leur explication des problèmes, des crises, les défis actuellement,
challenges which are ongoing. Well, it's very clear that the climate crisis
des milieux en jeu, c'est une cause de notre situation économique. For the first time, it appears in reading this fall economic statement that increasingly Finance Canada recognizes a threat to our economic health and a cause of the instability globally that we face is the climate crisis. References in this fall economic statement, not just for we're going to have a fund that's going to, and I'm pleased to see investment tax credits to more clean tech development. I will flag that small modular reactors should not be on that list, but for solar, for wind, for low flow hydro, for geothermal, and for the technologies that allow us to avoid waste of energy. All of this is really good stuff, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where Finance Canada notes that the disruption of supply chains is caused, at least in part, by climate crisis events. Disruption of supply chains like goods can't get to market when the water is so low in the Mississippi River that Canadian bitumen can't reach refineries in the U.S. Interruptions to supply chains created by things like atmospheric rivers that wipe out the roads to the lower mainland of Vancouver. We're still paying. This fall economic statement points to the costs that will continue to be experienced and the need to help Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec. So they've got ongoing costs to help people recover from Hurricane Fiona. We still have billions of dollars from last year's fall economic statement to help British Columbia recover. And in that set of atmospheric river events we had last fall, recall that every single land connection to Vancouver, the largest city in Western Canada, every single land route was disabled for a period of time. That had effect on supply chains. So supply chains are affected by the climate crisis. So too are the large economic events created by the climate crisis. And in real terms, droughts in other countries around the world drive up food prices for what Canadians pay in the stores. So the climate crisis is not a separate environmental issue that requires spending. It's actually becoming and begun to be seen in Finance Canada as a fabric, part of the fabric of the economic situation in which we find ourselves. And I'll go farther. When I said earlier that this is not your classic inflation. This is not your classic demand inflation, demand-driven inflation. Largely, we're experiencing now is supply-driven increase in costs because of, yes, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and climate crisis events, which are in real terms making things cost more. When things really cost more, the tools we have in monetary policy and Bank of Canada raising the rates won't have the same salutary effect. When we were dealing with, as in the early 70s, we had an inflation crisis. Former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau brought in emergency wage and price controls. That's not what we're experiencing now. We have real cost increases because of a real war and because of a climate emergency, and the costs and the prices are uneven all over the map. So when we look at the threats to our economy of the climate emergency, we have to realize we need to do much more. And it's clear from the way this document is prepared that whether it's being said out loud or not yet in Finance Canada, I've never read a document from Finance Canada ever which had so many references to the multiple ways in which the climate crisis is impacting our economy, all of them negative. I look to one point, though, and I think we are ignoring an opportunity that we need to seize. And the Honourable Minister of Finance's introductory remarks point to a moment back in 1903 when former Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier told this House that we cannot wait, that it is the time for action. And he was referring to the challenge to build a transcontinental railway. Well, for the moment, I'll skip over the cost in human lives, the impact in seizing Indigenous lands of building that railway. But let's just say right now we have a similar challenge and we are ignoring it. And that is, how do we link our electric grids together? The essence of a 100% carbon-free, not carbon neutral, carbon-free electricity grid with the electricity moving through it from solar power, and Alberta will be the big winner in solar power. Cheaper electricity can be produced by solar in Alberta than anywhere else in the country. Our existing hydro in BC, I wish to goodness we weren't talking about Site C, but we can do much, much more with renewable energy across Canada. And the storage system that we mostly need is that our grid should work. Grid should work east, west, and north, south. We're not talking about that in this fall economic statement. We're not really addressing it anywhere because we run up against the perennial problem of federation. We can't ship beer across Canada and we can't ship electricity. We can't get electricity from Manitoba Hydro across from eastern Manitoba to western Ontario, so we don't have interties. And that area, I happen to know well, is important boreal forest. We should have interties, but that's Indigenous land. If we honor UNDRIP, which we must, it requires free prior informed consent before we even start drawing lines on the map for the electricity grid. We know that there are private sector entrepreneurs already who see the way that they can get electricity from Hydro-Quebec to none of it. We have to think big, and we have to recognize that just as in 1903 the challenge was building a trans-Canadian railway, we need, as a modern industrialized country, to have a trans-Canadian electricity grid, because the grid is the battery. I just, for one moment, Madam Speaker, give the one short example. In Europe, with separate nation states within the European Union, they actually coordinate and work better together than our provinces and territories work with the federal government. It's appalling, but true. Denmark produces so much excess wind energy that Denmark sells its excess wind energy to Norway. Norway buys the cheap and green wind energy from Denmark, and if it doesn't need it that day, it pumps it up into existing reservoirs. This is called pump storage. It's one of the technologies mentioned here. And it stays there till Norway needs it. Then they open up the sluices, the water follows gravity, drives the turbines, and then when the cheap wind energy comes over from Denmark, they pump it back up. It's elegant, it's simple, it's international exchange of electricity that we cannot do in Canada because we don't have the interties, and it's a big project. And it needs to be mentioned, and it needs to be thought through. Lastly, I'll just close on these points, Madam Speaker. This increase in costs that Canadians are feeling is not our normal inflation. It is not demand-driven. It is not that either, I say to my honourable friend from Kingston, the Islands. I can hear him, and I'm not going to say that out loud because I know it's prohibited in this House. This is not normal inflation in the sense that it is not demand driven primarily. It is partly. It is largely being driven by a war in Ukraine, which we must, and I did want to mention this, Canadians, we support Ukraine. We believe that President Zelensky and his bravery and that of the Ukrainian people must be reflected in our solidarity with them. But in that solidarity, we must do much, much more to achieve a peace, to push for, and this is relevant to the fall economic statement, because so much of the increased prices we're experiencing here are because of Putin's brutal, illegal, immoral war on Ukraine. We must use every lever as a soft power to push for peace talks, to push for ceasefires. It's not good enough to say, we stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. We have to do more for peace because we're a country that can do that. And we may have to say to our NATO allies, if belonging to NATO means we really can't help Ukraine, maybe we don't belong in NATO. If NATO can't work for peace and NATO can't work for nuclear disarmament, maybe it's time to ask our NATO allies, what's the good of an alliance that can't protect Ukraine because of nuclear weapons inside NATO and inside Russia that threaten us all? But we have to face the real costs that are going up. We have to face multiple crises at the same time to avoid a global food crisis, to avoid a global water crisis. We must do more in this country as global leaders on climate change. And that means stopping the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, converting that Crown Corporation to other uses that are actually beneficial for Canadians, such as building resiliency across this country, building the infrastructure we need. We do not need the Trans Mountain expansion. It is, in the words of Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, it represents moral and economic madness. So too does expanding to drilling off the coast of Newfoundland and Bay du Nord. So too does continuing fracking across Canada while pretending that Canadian liquefied natural gas is somehow better than coal. On doit faire face à toutes ces réalités, les réalités économiques, mais aussi les réalités de la guerre et les réalités de crise, de changement climatique. We can actually avoid the worst of climate change by changing course quickly. We can follow the indicators that the Minister of Finance has given us in this budget and say by spring 2023, let the budget stand for Canada laying down the markers that we move, according to the science, to move off fossil fuels, protect the workers in that sector, and make sure that Canadians are in a house that can stand the coming storms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Then comments, the honour for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my friend from Saanich Gulf Islands. Before the pandemic, one of our big concerns was the gig economy, and a lot of people looking at 2 or maybe even 3 very low-paying jobs to make a go of it. Now, that sector seems to be short of people, as the people who used to be in the gig economy move up to take the place of guys my age who've retired. Some of us haven't got the memo yet, but still, we have a lot of older Canadians now who backed out of the labor market. So we have an immigration plan that will bring more people into the country to fill those jobs. But I wonder if the honourable member could reflect on whether or not we should make an extra effort to avoid a new class, a new generation of low-paid gig workers in Canada.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague with a great question. We are also facing, and the Canadian Labour Congress published a piece on it a couple of years ago, the new world of work. What does our economy look like for workers when we look at artificial intelligence? So we have a gig economy that's already made many people insecure in the jobs they've got. I completely agree with my honourable friend that we are seeing, as people retire, we have a demographic bubble of boomers who are leaving the workforce, and we don't have enough people coming up behind us. That's why we're looking in this fall economic statement at increases in immigration and hoping that those people are trained professionals, workforce, construction workers particularly are mentioned in the statement. But we could do far more to prepare for artificial intelligence by moving to guaranteed livable income as quickly as possible to protect our economy from the coming shocks. And then people can choose, knowing that they have just enough income to be above the poverty line, to maybe work a bit in the gig economy, maybe have a garden at home, maybe spend more time in community volunteering, but we'll be a healthier society and better able to withstand any shocks that are coming once we adopt a guaranteed livable income.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire pour le Premier ministre et pour la présidente du Conseil du Trésor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Puis à chaque fois que j'écoute mon honorable collègue de Saanich Gulf Islands, j'apprends beaucoup. Et j'aimerais la remercier encore une fois pour son excellent discours et analyse de l'énoncé économique à l'automne. Madame la Présidente, ma question, je dois remarquer que l'honorable député a mentionné que l'inflation n'est pas typique cette fois-ci. Et puis, il y avait une reconnaissance par la ministre des Finances et son ministère de cette question. J'aimerais lui poser une question très honnête. Nous savons tous, parce que j'écoute ma collègue très souvent, on sait bien que même si on cessait toute activité économique, il y a un décalage entre nos activités et les émissions à gaz à l'effet de serre. Alors, il va y avoir des modifications, des changements dans notre climat, peu importe ce qu'on va faire maintenant. Est-ce qu'elle est en train de nous dire aussi qu'elle croit que dorénavant, il va y avoir toujours une pression inflationniste à cause des changements climatiques qui va perdurer pour longtemps jusqu'au moment qu'on va résoudre la crise climatique?
Le député de Saanich Gulf Islands.
Merci beaucoup à mon collègue de Hall-Elmer. Quelle bonne question. Nous sommes maintenant dans une période ce n'est pas court. Hein? Je veux utiliser c'est le titre d'un livre, je n'ai pas les mots en français. It's a book by James Kunstler about a decade ago called The Long Emergency, which predicted that we were going to see our economy significantly rocked by what will happen as fossil fuels become more expensive, as we move away from fossil fuels. And the long emergency was about where we are now. Real costs increasing, a real dislocation. Now, that doesn't mean ongoing inflationary trends. It does mean thinking about how a society flourishes despite these very unusual headwinds. They're unusual now because they're new, but they're not going away. So we have to think about that and make sure that we design our economy and our economic signals of what makes us better off. The GDP is not a good set of measurements to help us chart a course through ongoing climate emergency. We need to chart our course, and I think this is a global challenge that just as at the end of the Second World War, nations met at Bretton Woods to figure out what are the global and shared financial institutions that help us get through this. We need new institutions and a review, a new Bretton Woods, if you will, that will help both the post-COVID impacts on our economies, the current climate impacts on our economies, and we can't rewrite the laws of atmospheric physics and chemistry. We can easily rewrite the way we want our economy to work if all the economies and central banks of the world get together and say, all right, this is what we're looking at. How do we protect the citizens and the communities of all, and I would hope, the non-human species of Mother Earth?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In a previous question, the member for Saanich Gulf Islands spoke about a guaranteed basic income. In this House, there is legislation put forward, it's Bill C-22, that would provide that for Canadians with disabilities who are living in legislated poverty. However, in this fall economic statement, we didn't see anything with respect to funding the benefit, nor did we see anything with respect to emergency supports, like was done with CERB, to address the conditions of those living in poverty and those living with disabilities across the country. Can she speak more about this opportunity that, if it's not in this fall economic statement, how all parliamentarians can work together to continue to advocate to ensure that, if not now, then perhaps by budget 2023, that these critical supports are put into place?
The honourable for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague from Kitchener Centre. This is one of the big disappointments in the budget, in the fall economic statement, I must say, is that with work being done on C-22 in this place, with the unanimous support that C-22 received at second reading, I would have hoped we'd see something of an emergency short-term fund to ensure that no Canadian in the disability community is living below the poverty line, and we know that all too often people living with disabilities are in fact disproportionately part of the community of the lowest income Canadians. So yes, I think we need an emergency short-term support. We don't have to wait for the next budget. It could be brought forward anytime. We know we're going to see a Budget Implementation Act at some point. A Budget Implementation Act would be a good place to see an emergency short-term payment for people living with disabilities until C-22 can come through and be fully funded and fully enacted.
Time for a brief question. Bref question. The honourable for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to follow up another item that is mentioned in words in the fall economic statement, but not so much in actions, is addressing the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. And so it's in the preamble, but then when it comes to actual measures, there's only one mention of moving forward on a flipping measure to assignment sales for homes, but nothing when it comes to, for example, ensuring homes should be places for people to live and not simply a commodity for investors to trade. Can she comment on measures and what she might have wanted to see that would have more directly addressed not just the rhetoric that we need, but the measures to address the housing crisis?
A brief message, a brief response. There's 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks, my honourable colleague from Kitchener Centre. Is that the minister's speech talked about, quote, tackling housing speculation, but the flipping piece that's the only measure in here was already announced. We need to do much more. I would recommend with the 10 seconds I have left probably, we need to address how much of our homes and housing has been taken out of access for people to live in dwellings and has become part of an Airbnb market that is global, unaccountable, and pays very little taxes in Canada.
It being 7:05, pursuant to order made on Friday, October 28, 2022, the House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1. See you all tomorrow.